Hello, I think. um, Hopefully this is working. I'm just going to watch the chat for a bit to see where the incoming... Ah, yes. Hello. Right, hopefully everyone can hear. Good, that's very good. Let me just make sure all the... inputs are correct. Excellent. Right. Well, it's actually working for a change, which makes a big difference. Hang on, if I bring the microphone closer... Oh, I can actually bring the microphone very close with this setup. So, yes, we do have a little bit of time before we get stuck in, so I will pick up a couple of quick questions. Yes, that is a Star Fury, which I made myself. That is a Death Glider. So, Babylon 5, Stargate SG-1. That I didn't make myself, that's limited edition. Yes, there's a bunch of Carnotaurs over there. There's a Corellian Corvette and a couple of gold-plated Enterprises there. Stabby the Stringbag has moved into a slightly warmer environment. So yes, I'm broadcasting from a slightly new setup. As you can see, I'm still sorting out the background. This is basically the recording area. So yeah, that's basically oh, and all the gun turrets are now all up here. So yes, I'm going to be developing this a little bit more as time goes on. But yeah, it's basically the conservatory's lovely, spring, summer, autumn. Currently it's about 4 degrees outside, and the conservatory isn't that much warmer, so I'm going to be staying in here where it's warm. And of course, we have the Iron Brew. And you'll be glad to know the Goblet of Destiny is also back. So, as is traditional, we shall continue with the live stream broadcast until I run out of Iron Brew. And there we go. What's the bottle with the skull? Oh, the bottle with the skull. That's that is my warning dihydrogen monoxide containment device. So yeah, there's a few bits and pieces. I'm going to have something here-ish at some point, and more of the models and stuff, artwork, etc. So yeah, that's where we are now. Let me call up the list. So as is traditional with these live streams, I will be covering first the alternate history questions, etc. from October's Patreon question list, and then we're going to head on into your questions from the chat. So should all be quite fun. Osprey28 asking, "What are you borrowing? Why are you borrowing the Doctor's background?" I'm not. That's my artwork. This is my background. And you may hear occasional pops and bangs in the background because it is the 6th of November, and whilst the 5th of November was Guy Fawkes Night in the UK, some people obviously forgot to set off all their fireworks. And yes, Evil PC Diva, they are reborn. There is in fact a massive collection of Tyrannosaurs just off camera up the top. And the Nagato 2044, the sea mine is coming. Basically just having to move everything in from the conservatory because it's very cold there. So yeah, that's how everything is. And Camilla of the Volsky, this is what happens when you do heavy longbow shooting. And yes, there's an F-302 hiding behind the Star Fury. Now, questions. I'm sure there'll be more questions about the backdrop than anything else soon enough, but we shall see. Let's get on with the questions first. So the Legacy asked, if the Germans and Japanese had maintained a far tighter alliance in World War II and the Germans loaned the Japanese some of their fuel for the Japanese Navy, would it have been feasible for a combined German-Japanese fleet in the Atlantic theatre for a short period of time? If so, would such a combined navy have been able to secure the Mediterranean, secure the Middle East, to solve the fuel needs, engage the British Navy at parity, or even possibly open the window for Germany to accommodate Operation Sea Lion? And is this a feasible gamble? Would the United States have joined the war sooner? Would it have affected the Pacific theatre? The main thing is that the British and the Japanese, there's no real reason for the Japanese to come over to the Mediterranean. All their interests, and remember, they are already in a war with China. All their interests are in the Pacific. So Germany's not exactly got a lot of fuel in and of itself, so the amount of fuel you'd need to have significant amounts of the entire Japanese Navy show up in the Mediterranean would drown the German fuel reserves so badly. I don't think they even had in that much fuel. The other thing is, if they're coming from the Mediterranean, there are two major problems called the Suez Canal and the Straits of Gibraltar. If the Japanese Navy is coming at the British Navy with hostile intent, asking them to just fly or sail straight into one of those two is basically the British Navy's dream made true, because you're funneling all of them into a nice concentrated kill box, and I can just imagine there being pretty much the entire T-class just waiting there to volley hundreds of torpedoes at them. On paper, yes, the Japanese Navy put together does pose a considerable threat. The problem is, with the scenario, the question obviously seems to indicate that the Japanese fleet is turning up very early in the war, before it gets involved in a war with America. At that point, because of the 15-15-10 or 5-5-3 ratio that has mostly been maintained through the treaty era system, the Royal Navy still outnumbers the Japanese Navy. The Germans don't have Bismarck or Tirpitz in service. Scharnhorst and Gneisenau just about in service. And the Japanese don't have Yamato or Musashi and some of the other of their latest designs in service. And by trying to get into the Mediterranean, they're negating, because of those choke points, they're negating their big strength in carriers. And they also have the last generation of carrier aircraft aboard, things like the A5M, rather than the A6M0. They have a biplane dive bomber. The only aircraft that they have from what you'd recognise in 1941 would be the B5N torpedo bomber. But you're funneling them into a very, very narrow gap, which will negate those strengths and play to the Royal Navy's strengths in guns. So, yeah, it would just be a huge, huge risk for the Japanese, and something that would ensure colossal losses, especially because, as I said, the Germans just don't have the fuel to keep that fleet operating. So even if they manage to fight their way through Suez or Gibraltar somehow, they're going to end up operating for a few weeks in the Mediterranean before they run horrifically out of fuel. And then that's pretty much it. Yeah. Unfortunately, yeah, the fuel constraints are the big one here, apart from the fact to say the Japanese are never going to go for it. Apart from anything, the Japanese would be thinking the Americans will try and Pearl Harbor them. Then we've got Salamin Shikia 93. So this is a follow-up to the previous question on incomparable from the previous Patreon Drydock. if you're designing incomparable, so bear in mind this is the 1,000-footer with the 6 20-inch guns in 1915 to 16 thereabouts, ignoring cost, draft and length limitations, but keeping the speed, armour and 24,000 nautical miles cruising range, with the beam and the only time constraint, with the beam and time being the only constraints, how would you achieve 35 plus knots and such a cruising range? If I'm trying to design a 1,000-foot plus HMS Incomparable to hit 35 plus knots with the technology available in the mid-1910s, I'm not entirely sure it could be done. Within those constraints. You could possibly do it by basically making it a floating engine block that happens to have guns on top, but you'd have to lose all the armour. I genuinely don't think in the mid-1910s you could actually manage it, because by the time you've built a hull big enough to move the ship at 35 knots with the guns on board, it will have gotten so huge that you'll actually need to pump even more volume into the hull to fit the engines to move it, which means the hull's now got bigger, it resists more, which means you need more engines to move it, which means the hull, and so on and so on and so forth. With anything like a reasonable amount of armour and weapons, you'd basically have to sacrifice something so drastic it would no longer be anything like Incomparable. I just don't think it would work. The thing is, their technology comes on so markedly even in between the 1910s and the early 20s. UNSC forward onto Dawn. If Princess Royal assaulted Chile after World War I to replace Almirante Cochrane, Brazil and Argentina don't like the power balance and declares war. Who wins? Everyone's economy is kind of trash by the end of World War One, and that's not just the people who were involved in the war. The entire world economy went through a bit of a free-for-all before it stabilised. The thing is, the Brazilians are going to find it very difficult to get to Chile, and the only way they're going to really manage that mostly would be to try and go through Argentina. The Argentinians don't like the Brazilians anywhere near enough for them to go for that particular thing, so it's basically going to be Argentina versus Chile, or Brazil fights Argentina for the privilege of fighting Chile, and then the winner fights Chile, in which case Chile is probably just going to sit back and go, okay, well, when you're done, we'll deal with whoever review is left. Being on the defensive, the Chileans are probably going to come out of that ahead. If they go on the offensive, it'll all go horribly wrong, but they don't have to. Right, so that's Incomparable. Reva asks, a hopefully amusing possibility. New Zealand had originally wanted to fund a battleship. Yes, they did. This time they stand their ground. After some bureaucratic wrangling, the title of HMS New Zealand is eventually assigned to a Queen Elizabeth-class battleship, with our timeline's battleship name instead provided to the Indefatigable-class battlecruiser instead. But of course, with the name carries the luck of each respective ship, and the Queen Elizabeths are retained through various treaties. Which battleship would you preferentially pick to trade name and fortune with New Zealand to maximise advantage, and what does this mean for the fates of the vessels and their hijinks in their respective services? Well, if New Zealand's offering to pay up for a battleship and it ends up being a Queen Elizabeth, to be honest, I don't think it would take the place of one of the existing 5, because they were paid for by other means. It would probably be what was originally intended to be HMS Agincourt, the 6th Queen Elizabeth class, and that name obviously got passed on to the ex-Brazilian, ex-Ottoman ship that then got called Agincourt. In this situation, it's probably going to be that 6th Queen Elizabeth class, but let's go with the question as asked. If we're trading off names, I'd probably trade off Barham, mainly because, well, as you probably know, Barham suffered an unlucky multiple torpedo strike in the Mediterranean and blew up. None of the other Queen Elizabeths did, so trading off onto an indefatigable class battlecruiser, which, let's face it, is not exactly the world's, shall we say, most resilient of classes, is probably a relatively even trade. Certainly, you don't want to trade the luck of Warspite down onto a battlecruiser that's going to get decommissioned anyway in the early 1920s. So yeah, if I was going to trade any of them, I'd trade Barham over and put New Zealand in. Now, if New Zealand and its luck and its divine protection goes on to a Queen Elizabeth class, that is just going to be hilarious. The Queen Elizabeth class, apart from Barham, tend to live relatively sainted lives anyway. Add in New Zealand's level of luck and protection, and at that point you'll probably find a refitted HMS New Zealand just soloing the Italian Navy, or while it's or it gets stuck on convoy escort duty and Scharnhorst shows up only to have a spectacular engine breakdown as it enters gun range or something like that. That's the kind of hilariously plot-driven broken levels of luck that you'd have by combining a Queen Elizabeth hull with HMS New Zealand. Yeah, that would be quite funny. Nozdormu89, how do you design a super battleship, i.e. something like Yamato, something like Yamato, I guess? Well, how do you design a super battleship? You basically take all the traits of your current generation of battleships across the world and dial them up to 11. So if you're going to do, I mean, you can kind of see this with Dreadnought and to a certain extent with the Queen Elizabeths as well, although the jump isn't quite as severe as from Treaty era ships to Yamato. But effectively, the rough guide would be you probably maintain the speed, maybe aim for a knot or two faster, but the speed is probably Armour-wise, you probably want to increase armour by about 25%, or just design armour to be proof against your own guns, which was the usual way of doing it. And then with the guns, you jump everybody else's guns by at least a factor of 2 to 3 inches. So this is why the Yamatos went for 18 inch as opposed to everyone at the time was going for 15 and 16 inch, and so on and so forth. I just realised I left my phone on, so I'm going to turn that off. Yeah, so if you're designing a super battleship in, say, 1910, when everyone's got 12-inch guns moving on to 13 and 14-inch guns, so a Yamato-style battleship in 1910, 1912 would be a ship armed with, say, 9 to 10 16-inch guns and about 15 inches of armour. And a super battleship in HMS Dreadnought's time, 1906, 1907, would be, well, a Dreadnought-style ship. So in that case, you're going for more guns rather than an increase in caliber. But you'd be going at that point maybe for 14 inches of armour against other 12-inch gunships. So yeah, that would be your starting point for designing a super battleship, and you're also probably looking at about double the displacement of everything else that's contemporary. So Dreadnought era, probably you want to launch straight into the high 20s of thousands of tons. In 1910, you're probably looking at 45,000 tons, that kind of thing. 22NF2 asks, alternate history. By some quirk in spacetime, Admiral Nelson and Admiral Beatty swap places. Nelson arrives to command the battle cruisers on the eve of Jutland, whilst Beatty assumes command of the English fleet on the eve of Trafalgar. Who would fare better, and how would their tactics and strategies alter the outcome of the battles? This is one of the places where Beatty actually probably does fairly well, believe it or not, because Beatty's idea of charging closer, I want to shoot them as quickly as possible, is pretty much Nelsonian, and of course he has the advantage of he knows how the Battle of Trafalgar went, so he can launch straight in and, well, without massive amounts of stacked cordite, or I guess gunpowder in the Age of Sail, all over the place. His ships aren't that much vulnerability of blowing up. So driving his fleet headlong into the enemy fleet and trying to blaze away with as many guns as he can get his hands on, that's basically going to win the Battle of Trafalgar fairly handily. Nelson, it depends on when he gets dumped into it. So if he's at the eve of the Battle of Jutland, obviously you've got the more prosaic stuff where he's completely out of time and has no idea what on earth is going on, which would be the biggest problem. But if we assume for whatever reason that he has been granted the ability to understand the tactics and the ships, etc. involved, he is again very aggressive. He wants to close the range, but Nelson appreciates the value of good gunnery perhaps in a slightly better way than Beatty does. And also, Nelson's very good at signalling. Nelson's good at telling people what he wants them to do before the battle happens. For all that ghoul, yes, why are all these sailors worshipping me? That probably would have been something of an issue as well. Yeah, so assuming that he gets a kind of a crash course in what he's supposed to be doing, he probably will fare slightly better, if for no other reason than he will make absolutely sure pre-battle that every captain knows what he wants them to do, which means that even if nothing else changes aboard the British battle cruisers, 5th Battle Squadron is probably right on their tail. Which, at that point, it's a 2-to-1 advantage to the British, and it's 5th Battle Squadron, it's the Queen Elizabeth. We know what they did when they showed up historically, so Nelson, unsurprisingly, probably does better. Dennis Kocher, if Prince Eugen had stayed with Bismarck instead of splitting off, do you think it would have increased Bismarck's chances of survival, or do you think it would have doomed both ships? Alternatively, what if Scharnhorst or Gneisenau had been available to sortie with them as originally planned? Sortying Scharnhorst and or Gneisenau probably actually ends up worse for the Germans, because if they sortie in that kind of strength, you're not going to have Tovey stay in harbour with King George V and Victorious waiting to see what happens. He will sail with a full force, so you're going to have 2 King George V's plus Hood plus Victorious, which means more airstrikes, etc. And with Victorious available and probably at least a cruiser squadron, it's very unlikely you're going to lose contact as easily. So yeah, actually deploying Scharnhorst and Gneisenau probably ends worse for the Germans. If Prince Eugen stays with Bismarck instead of splitting off, under most of the circumstances, it's probably going to doom both of them, because there were more than enough ships present at the end that Prince Eugen's presence isn't really going to make much difference. But where it might have increased Bismarck's chances of survival is when the swordfish attacks come in, it's a whole extra set of anti-aircraft guns firing. And as covered in the video on Operation Rheinebung, the swordfish did take a lot of damage. And if you've got an alternate set of guns firing from an alternate angle, there's a lot greater chance that some of those swordfish might get knocked out of the sky on their way in, which in turn means that the fatal torpedo hit to the stern probably doesn't happen, which in turn means that they almost certainly managed to make it under Luftwaffe air cover. Ray W asks, Exocet would bounce off the side of a battleship, so would an Exocet go through a battleship? Should we build battleships again, i.e. armour up our ships? Yeah, in theory, something like an Exocet would bounce off the side of a battleship in terms of hitting it on its armour. The problem is modern missiles don't just fly straight into the side of a ship. They do a kind of a pop-up to dive down on the deck, which would bypass the majority of a battleship's defences, I think. And again, obviously this isn't my strong suit, But with modern missiles, I think pretty much the only ones that still go in for the "I'm just going to slam into you" technique are the really big things like the Russian Mach 3 missiles that are the size of a large coach or something, at which point the sheer amount of kinetic force that's involved isn't going to do anything good anyway. Stafford Magnus, why do British naval guns have flared ends while those of other countries do not? Depends on the time period, but a lot of it is down to the method of construction and a little bit of tradition. Having slightly flared ends on naval guns does mean slightly increased strength and durability for the gun barrel, because if a gun is going to split anywhere through just normal wear and tear, it's almost certainly going to be at the muzzle, because everywhere else you've got parts of material that makes up the barrel constraining it all the way along, and at the far end you've got the breech. So at the muzzle end, that's where there's nothing resisting further beyond, so cracks and such are likely to develop and spread in more general terms there, unless obviously there's a design weakness somewhere along the gun, but that's another matter. So having slightly more material on the end of the barrel means those stress fractures are less likely to form, which makes things slightly more durable. But at the same time, metallurgy was advancing to the point that probably wasn't necessary after a while, and it does make the gun tip much heavier, which means there's more chance of barrel droop. So you do get flared barrels, but even in the British service, those are fading out towards as time goes on in the big gun era. Tyridian89 asks, scenario from the Drydock way back. The nuclear CVN 65 Enterprise replaces CV6 Enterprise. How do the logistics work on that? How long do supplies on board last? What can they build? What can they teach the shore to build? The more advanced supplies probably don't last too long, although if CVN 65 has just had a nuclear refueling, World War II doesn't last as long as the fuel cycle on a nuclear carrier. The main thing is going to be the spare parts. Now, fair enough, a lot of those could probably be machined. Some of the early computer stuff wouldn't be. But in terms of such stuff like jet engines and stuff, most of her time in service, that's probably a bit too advanced for World War II to make. It would be better just using her as a massive flight deck and using a lot of her tech to point the way forward. Albeit maybe if it's right at the earliest point of her launch, some of the radar tech might allow for some fairly big jumps in radar technology there and then. Nolsdormer89 asking, did civilian maritime engineering have a noticeable effect on naval engineering and vice versa? Yes, more so at the dawn of the ironclad era, because iron ships and steamships were adopted and in a lot more wide service in the civilian sector before they saw a real big uptake in the military sector. So a lot of that was cross-pollinated technology. Later on, most of the advances, once you get into the proper ironclad era and then into the steel era, most of that is more military stuff crossing over into civilian stuff. Although the turbine engine is technically a civilian development. But at that point, the military technologies become so specialized, if it's going to cross-pollinate anyway, it's going to cross-pollinate back into the merchant marine. Well, the merchant marine did continue to develop triple and quadruple expansion engines, so on smaller ships, I guess that's probably a bit of cross-pollination there. Okay, some of those are timing out. I'm going to have to move on. So, Stalrunner, why did other navies during the treaty era not seem as concerned about turret and barbette armor as the US Navy? Basically, priorities of where you put the armor. Where do you think you're likely to be hit? If you're aiming to fight at a closer range, chances are your belt armor's more likely to be hit. If you're aiming to fight at longer ranges, which the USN was, then your belt armor becomes less and less susceptible to hits, but because you're anticipating a lot more deck hits, then the surface area of the turrets becomes a much more apparent target. If you look at a turret dead on, in actual fact, I shall bring this one down. Yeah, so if you're fighting at close range, that's kind of your turret profile. And that's a fairly small target. If you're fighting at a range where you're anticipating shells coming down on you from quite high up, let's say 30 degrees, now you can see suddenly that's actually a much bigger target profile, and obviously the gun's going to be elevated. So then all of a sudden your turret armor becomes a lot more of a concern, because it's possibly going to be hit a lot more. But yeah, that's my 15-inch turret. Galdir Ionai, much has been made of German Army and Air Force use of drugs, particularly amphetamines. Yes, have a Panzerschocker, lad. How about the Kriegsmarine and other contemporary navies? Not so much, because they had a lot more. They had a lot more time, I guess, would be the way of putting things. You're not on continuous operations in a ship, and ships have multiple crews, multiple watches, so you can afford to stand them down, and you can feed them if necessary, etc. and so on. So yeah, it means you don't quite need to pump your crew full of amphetamines in quite the same way that maybe a tank crew or an air crew or a infantryman might need to be, because you don't have two crews in a tank. If there's going to be 48 hours of continuous operations, you need your tank crew to be awake and available 48 hours. If there's going to be 48 hours of continuous operations on a ship, then like, oh, okay, first crew on, then they go off watch and the other guys come on watch, and if you're on a 3-watch system, then the next guys come on watch, and so on and so forth. It can get tiring, but you can keep people going without having to ram them full of illicit substances a lot longer on a ship than you can on land. Galdor Iona, following up with the U-boat fleet, might have found some use for it. Theoretically, maybe, but to be perfectly honest, if you're in a situation in a U-boat where you need to be awake and alert and at combat stations for 48 hours or more, you probably have significantly more problems than whether or not you've got some amphetamines on board. Chris Gregory, firstly, Lord Drakenfell, we've learned that the Kriegsmarine are planning to launch an invasion of Norway coinciding with our planned operation. Oh, so this is 1940. Should we proceed as planned? What are your orders? Well, of course we're not going to proceed as planned, because the plan was... it didn't work. It was awful. If it was up to me, I would actually... Did I say the plan was awful? I would actually technically stick to the plan as it originally was. Part of the problem was you had a whole bunch. You had 4 heavy cruisers loaded up with troops and supplies, then having them offloaded, then having them reloaded, and that lost the drop on the Germans. Also, obviously, that they didn't know the Kriegsmarine was coming. If they knew the Kriegsmarine was coming... The problem is, if you let the Germans invade first, you have the advantage. So in the Battle of Narvik video that I did, it pointed out, the day before the Germans invaded, the Norwegian Navy was thinking more about having to fight the British than they were the Germans. Once the Germans attacked, they were rather looking forward to the arrival of the British to help get rid of the Germans. So... if you hit Norway first, you obviously have the advantage of surprise, but maybe not as much as you'd think, being the British, because, as I say, the Norwegians are expecting them, and you look like the aggressor. I would personally keep the troops loaded on the cruisers. I would, obviously using, and now I have my foreknowledge, I would position destroyer, cruiser, and battle cruiser flotillas a little bit off of the main targets, especially Narvik and Bergen. And then, as soon as I've got confirmation that they've gone in, I would then send in overwhelming force. So, let's say at Narvik, the Germans have 10 destroyers in there. I would probably send in 3 or 4 light cruisers and a dozen destroyers. So, just as the Germans are beginning to offload their troops, etc., my ships come sweeping in and shoot them in the back in the middle of a massive snowstorm. and then move the cruisers in with my own troops to displace the German troops, and probably catch Scharnhorst and Gneisenau out at sea with repulse and renown. But to be perfectly honest, that's because I know what happened, so I can mitigate against the biggest blunders. To be honest, anyone with a decent book about the Norwegian campaign would obviously be able to do that. But yeah, those would be my main things. Would be hit the Germans immediately after they've shown themselves to be the hostiles, because they're not entrenched enough that it won't be easy to kick them out. But they've given themselves over as the aggressors, which works perfectly for me. Nolan Setzer, in his book Battle of the Surigao Strait, A.P. Tully details the 7th Fleet battleships only had 6 salvos of armour-piercing rounds left. Did you take this into account in your Samar alternate history scenario? Does this change your results? I didn't strictly take it into account in the Samar alternate history scenario, because the main alternate history scenario there posited that the Taffy forces and 7th Fleet switched places, so 7th Fleet never fought the Battle of Surigao Strait in the alternate history scenario. If they had, obviously they would have, as Tully notes, they were very short on ammunition, on armor-piercing ammunition afterwards. That would have massively affected the equation. But, as I say, in the actual alternate history scenario, we assume 7th Fleet was there in place of Taffy 3, so it wouldn't have been so much of a problem. But yeah, I dread to think, actually, if you'd ended up with 6 salvos worth of AP rounds and you were facing off against Kurita in standard battleships, that wouldn't have been a pretty sight. Then again, you just keep shooting HE rounds. You'd probably set a lot of things on fire. Blogs pointing out about 4-inch AA ammo in Norway. Yes, but the thing is, you don't need to occupy Norway, you just have to destroy the German forces. So if you hit them 12 to 24 hours after they've started their landing, you can catch most of them pretty much at their landing points. You can wipe out the Kriegsmarine forces. You land to force the German surrender, and let's face it, if the Germans are facing, all their supply ships have been sunk, all of their Kriegsmarine support has either run away or been sunk. So they're running low on supplies, they're running low on ammo, the Norwegian forces haven't capitulated yet, and they've got British forces landing at their backs. They're going to give up pretty quickly before the Luftwaffe air threat can really get going, at which point you can drop back and say, okay, well, we're good. Leave Norway at that point is probably going to ally with you anyway. Nolan Setzer, Tully claims this was before Surigao. I'd have to check that. I'd be very surprised if they only had 6 salvos of AP ammunition before Surigao, because if they did, then during the Battle of Surigao, if I'm remembering the sequence of events correctly, they would have run out partway through bombarding the Japanese battleship, Yamashiro, I think. So I'd have to check that first. "25th Dragoon. The dastardly time traveller has once again kidnapped you, depositing you in the USSR in the 1930s. What did I do to deserve that? I don't think I've been that evil. That's quite a horrifying fate. Glorious Comrade Stalin has tasked you with building a navy to rival the Allies and the Japanese. You have permission to build as many warships as you can. They can be as large as you believe the infrastructure can handle. Generous Comrade also helps by making the decision between carriers and battleships for you. The future of naval warfare must be a hybrid between the two. A warship that can comfortably handle ship-to-ship combat whilst also providing a strike force for armoured attack aircraft. How do you please, greatest secretary, with design choice and combat performance? To be honest, I'd probably build the single fastest ship I could possibly find and sail as hard as possible out into the North Sea and claim sanctuary. Because, life expectancy under Stalin, not very long. But if I'm stuck there, probably chained to my desk literally, a Soviet hybrid battleship carrier, now that would be a thing to see. Given the infrastructure limitations, though... Whew. If it's the early 1930s and the worst I have to think about fighting is probably the Deutschlands, I'd probably actually end up building one of the slightly less insane carrier hybrids. Actually, where is it? I've got a book down there on which is actually all about hybrid warships, and I believe it was a British design at one point, and it basically had a turret either end of the ship and then a conventional carrier flight deck down the middle. That's probably the closest you can get to realistically plausible. And you'd have to build a ship very big, which Russian industry could do. It wouldn't have to be particularly heavily armoured, because I'm mainly concerned with fighting the Deutschlands. So I've got that as an advantage. So I'd probably put a triple 12-inch turret forward, triple 12-inch turret aft. That gives me more firepower than a Deutschland class. The thing's probably going to have to be pushing 900 foot long, and then I can put a decent length flight deck in the middle. It's going to be hilariously inefficient. Probably have a strike group of maybe 40. But it would certainly outmatch a Deutschland. I don't know if anything else it could outmatch, but it would certainly manage to do that. And if we give it an icebreaker bow and hide it up in the northern seas, it might even survive more than 5 minutes. Now, I would get that book out because I'm going to show you the diagram. Unfortunately, there's about 3 other books stacked on top of it, and everything will fall over. Stalrunner asks, what's the earliest built US Navy cruiser that would have been reliably able to take on Graf Spee in a one-on-one fight? I don't know about reliably in terms of guaranteed victory, but reliably as in have a decent chance of either doing an awful lot of damage, and or having more than 35% chance of victory. I'd probably say Wichita or Wichita. I don't know quite how it's pronounced, but yeah, that because it's got armor enough that it can probably take hits a little bit better than... Well, it can take hits a bit better than most other heavy cruisers. It's got 9 8-inch guns of a relatively modern manufacture. We know 8-inch guns can hurt the Graf Spee. So, and they obviously can fire faster than the 11-inch guns. They've got the speed to close down the Graf Spee, so that rate of fire will actually matter. So yeah, I'd say Wichita would probably be the first US heavy cruiser I'd feel comfortable taking up against a Graf Spee and expect to walk away from it, or at least have a decent chance of walking away from it. John Rose says it's pronounced the last one, so Wichita. Wichita. Fair enough. David Conacher asks, how important was Halifax Harbour during the 2 World Wars? Very important. The Halifax explosion was not a good thing. There was an awful lot of industry, as well as a lot of troops coming out of Canada, and Halifax was one of the main harbours that it was all sent from. So, yeah, it's an incredibly important piece of real estate for everybody in both wars. Then we are on to Colin Williams. Centre Force, as they are on the morning of October 25th, 1944, so this is Kurita's force at the Battle of Samar, versus the Grand Fleet as they are at Jutland. They replaced the High Seas Fleet like for like in, let's say, 1815. So this is a bit late in the day. That's a good one. They're faster than the Grand Fleet, for sure, so if they want to just disengage, they can without much of a problem. In terms of sheer numbers, you've only got 4 capital ships. Now, fair enough, the heavy cruisers are probably, between their long lances and their guns, probably have the firepower to cause some real problems for the Grand Fleet, and they certainly can engage at a range that will cause problems for the Grand Fleet as well. But at the same time, Yamato has some radar, but not, as we established fire control at the battle, not fire control radar. So the weather the gloom, etc., that pervades in that environment at the Battle of Jutland means that they actually probably can't see far enough to take advantage of that range advantage, at which point they are even more hilariously outnumbered than the High Seas Fleet were. Now, I say yes, things like Nagato and Yamato will be able to do a lot of damage. The Congo and Haruna, not so much. Their armour will be breached very quickly, and their speed will only save them if they run away very fast. But even with Nagato and Yamato, the sheer number of battleships present, they're just going to be smothered in shells, and that will stop breaking things one way or another very quickly. But yeah, I mean, if it was a clearer day, if it was a time when they actually could use their range advantage with good visibility, then it would be an entirely different ball game. Basically, just kill ships until they run out of ammo, especially for Yamato. But they didn't. My screen is about to turn itself off, so I'm going to have to try and make it stop there. Yeah, the thing with the Jutland replacement scenarios with smaller but more modern fleets, it basically pivots around, do they have radar, surface search and fire control radar? If they do, then they have a huge advantage. If they don't, most of their advantages are taken away by the fact that they have to close into what is ideal gunnery range for the ground fleet anyway. Coltex, yes, we're still on. Well, we're still on Patreon questions basically. Luke Murphy, World War I era warships carried 47mm saluting guns. Did the weapons serve any combat purpose, or were they purely ceremonial? Basically ceremonial, unless you happen to be involved in going to oppress some poor tribesman, in which case they could be demounted and used as light field artillery. Then we have, how would a Japanese cruiser force have fared against the East Asia Squadron had they found Spey before Craddock did? Assuming no Japanese capital ships are present, done. So that means no Congos. A heavy Japanese cruiser force would have done better than Craddock. The Japanese had... I mean, Craddock had a lot of old... Well, he didn't even have a lot of ships, but the ships he had apart from Glasgow were very old. The Japanese had a fair number of relatively modern protected and armoured cruisers, including some fairly heavy hitters. So, if it was a sort of a typical Japanese cruiser formation, they would have done a lot better against the East Asia Squadron. Exactly how much better is somewhat open to question, because the two Scharnhorsts under von Spey were very good, and they were some of the most advanced armoured cruisers of the period. So just if the Japanese just come up against them with two armoured cruisers, kind of mirror match the force, I'd actually still put money on von Spey. He was very good, and he had very good ships. But the Japanese don't have to do that. The Japanese could turn up with 4 armoured cruisers, at which point he's in a lot of trouble. Osprey 28. Would we see any differences in naval technology if World War I never happens, but rather a bunch of smaller, spread-out wars, such as you get in Rule the Waves? Yeah, naval technology probably actually advances somewhat quicker, because it was effectively put on pause for most of the major powers by World War I. You can see the progression from 12-inch to 13.5-inch to 15-inch dreadnoughts in British service, 11 to 12 to 15 in German, 12 to 14, and then later to 16 in American service, and so on and so forth. But there's this huge gap. And actually compare and contrast the American Navy to the Royal Navy is a very good way of doing this. The Americans come out of the war basically having done standard all the way, pretty much all the way through. The British really only have a kind of gun line parity because the Queen Elizabeth and Revenge classes were so much bigger than the individual standard classes. So numerically, they actually came out roughly on top. But not roughly with parity. But if the British hadn't had to pause capital ship construction during World War One, then the Revengers would have been followed by something else in 1915, which would have then been followed by something else in 1916, something else in 17, something else in 18, and you probably would have seen the advent of the 16-inch armed ship probably in somewhere like 1916, 1917, I would imagine. And by the end of the 1910s, you're going to end up with probably 18-inch guns by that point, assuming that they can make them work. I mean, Furious had an 18-inch gun. I wouldn't necessarily want to use that particular 18-inch gun because it wasn't the world's best, but they could probably develop an iterative version of that, and that was with World War One going on. Style Runner asks, what's your opinion of Mark Mitcher? Pretty good admiral. Very, very wedded to aircraft, but with obviously for good reason. Did rob the US Navy of a few rather nice or interesting battleship moments by just jumping around, going, aha, I'm going to kill everything with aircraft, which wasn't necessarily a bad shout, to be honest. I mean, if you're a US admiral and you're given command of stupid amounts of aircraft carriers, of course you're going to do blacken the skies and fly my pretties and kill everything in sight. Oh dear. Gridewall, I think, asks, Battle of Midway unfolds as per historical timeline with one exception. The Japanese Navy reverts to pre-war doctrine and sails the carriers as two divisions. First carrier division, Akaga and Kagi, and second carrier, Hiryu and Soryu, and they are physically separated by enough distance that the strikes that traditionally take out 3 carriers only take out one of the carrier divisions, 2 in total, 2 carriers that is. This leaves the remaining carrier division, whichever one you wish, intact. How does this then map out with the remainder of the battle? Given that you think when you think the one remaining carrier managed to launch the strike that knocked down Yorktown, and Midway is still relatively early into 42, so US Navy AA doctrine and fighter control doctrine is nowhere near kind of what it would be later on. If you've got 2 intact carriers operating together, then the US probably is going to lose 2 carriers, or it's going to lose Yorktown and another carrier is going to be very heavily damaged. The US is probably still going to be able to marshal a return strike to sink one or both of them. So the US is probably going to come out ahead, but it's going to be a lot more closely contested. Because, yes, basically, one Japanese carrier managed to trade 1-for-1 with the American fleet. 2 Japanese carriers, they're going to cause more damage before they can be put down. Animals 16365. If Ark Royal wasn't torpedoed, would the Royal Navy have refitted her to a support carrier like HMS Unicorn in the British Pacific Fleet? Unlikely. She probably would have been a flagship, because she would have been able to support a lot more aircraft than even the Implacables could. Whether they would have kept her quite so close to the front line, given that she is somewhat more vulnerable to kamikazes, is another matter. But yeah, I think she still would have had a frontline role, maybe just a slightly towards the back of the fleet frontline role. They definitely wouldn't have downgraded her to a Unicorn-style ship, no, I don't think. Dale Huff asks, have you ever heard of the USS Pasco supply ship, and where did she spend her service years? I have heard of the Pasco in passing. I couldn't tell you off the top of my head where she spent her service years, but if there's anywhere that's going to tell you very quickly, it would be the Dictionary of American Naval Fighting Ships, because that seems to have information on literally anything that ever sailed under the Stars and Bars. No, Stars and Bars? Stars and Stripes, sorry. Wow, that was awful. I apologise deeply to all American viewers. Stars and Stripes. I was desperately trying to think, what do the Americans call their flag? And they thought, oh, horizontal, are they stripes or bars? Whoops. Yeah, that was... I'm going to shut up now and move on to another question. Waldo739. Sorry if this question is a bit out there. Okay. On May 26th, Bismarck's being pursued by the Royal Navy. A lone US Navy Catalina flies over the Bismarck. Bismarck signals to the Catalina that they want to surrender to the US. This is done by signal lights and partially observed by trailing Royal Navy and Polish units. On the morning of the 27th, Bismarck is heaved to with an American Catalina bobbing next to it and an American flag flying above the Kriegsmarine ensign. Battleship has signaled to the Royal Navy that it's surrendered and now in their custody. What do you think the three results -- reactions would be with Britain's closest and neutral ally intervening in this hunt? In the immediate term, what would happen with the Royal Navy heavy units showing up besides Admiral Tovey asking what on earth's going on? They'd probably insist on escorting it in. Medium term, Bismarck and crew are safely escorted back to the US and interned. Time frame: arrival by Bismarck of December 8th, 1941. Long term, Germany declares war on the US. The US now has an interned and repaired and examined Pride of Germany sitting in its harbour. What would the US do with it? Use it or let it sit in harbour? So, immediate term, it's taken Bismarck off the table as a threat. The Royal Navy is not going to be particularly happy they didn't get to avenge the Hood, but yeah. If it's off the table, it's off the table. I say they probably just make damn sure that they escort it in. I imagine Rodney's going to America for a refit anyway, so they would probably sail Rodney along with Bismarck with all 9 16-inch guns pointing at Bismarck the entire way. Medium term, if Bismarck's arriving in late 41, you've got Pearl Harbor. Given that the Americans were making noises about buying Almirante La Torre off the Chileans, if they've got a fully intact and working Bismarck in harbour, they're probably going to press it into service as a battleship for use in the Pacific. Whether it'll fit through the Panama Canal is another matter, but yeah, they would certainly be stuck in at that point. Long term, when Germany declares war, yeah, they probably initially be using it in the Pacific to shore up their position until they can get their own new battleships in service. Once that occurs, once you've got like North Carolinas and South Dakotas coming online, I don't know if the US would continue using Bismarck. They'd probably, just for commonality of supplies and spares, they'd probably use their own ships, at which point, assuming it's still working, they might actually cheekily offer it back to the British to use against the Germans, because that would be amusing and the British probably would go for it. Archangel Glenn asks, assuming all three are equal in training, who would win in a fight? USS Reno, HMS Arethusa, or the Japanese Agano? Let me just check the Reno. Oh, it's an Atlanta. Okay. Right, so I don't think Agano is going to win, because Agano was designed as a command ship for other ships as well as being a light cruiser. So Arethusa and Reno probably have the overall advantage against it. If it comes down to a fight between Reno, i.e. an Atlanta class, and Arethusa, which is an Arethusa class, it's going to depend on what range they're fighting at. If the range gets closer, Reno will have a massive advantage because Arethusa doesn't really carry enough armour to resist the 5-inch fire, and Reno has a lot of 5-inch guns. If the fight starts out at a longer range, 15,000-20,000 yards, then Arethusa probably has the advantage because its 6-inch guns can reach out fairly reliably and do a lot of damage at that range before the Atlanta can get in close. Then we have, so with that, then we have Bill Luster asking, in a hypothetical world, 1940 Japan declares war on Germany instead of the US and sends its fleet into the Mediterranean to support the British and Free Dutch in exchange for natural resources from the East Asian colonies and free hand in China. How would the combined British-Japanese force interact with one another and engage the Axis? Ooh. They've basically been staring daggers at each other for about a decade at this point, and it will be politically very precarious because the Americans have been twisting the thumbscrews on Japan to try and stop them from doing things they don't like in the Western Pacific. And if they're all of a sudden faced with now the Japanese have a free hand of resources because the Dutch East Indies are trading them oil and etc., the Americans are not going to be all that happy with the British and the Dutch, because their biggest leverage that doesn't involve going to war over Japan has just been removed, and which means Japan can continue its expeditions in China, etc. So politically, it's going to be a very, very interesting thing. But let's putting that to one side, just looking at from the pure tactical perspective, there is still a certain holdover of respect amongst the senior officers, because people like Yamamoto, etc., would have been in Japanese service when they were still allies. How much the intervening interwar period has built up resentment that would make that difficult to manage would be a rather interesting factor. Although engaging the Axis, yeah, Taranto, except now with the Kido Butai, that would clear up the Mediterranean pretty quick. Albeit that I think, given that at that point the Japanese would desperately want, as soon as they can get Yamato into service, they'd want to get some battleship action in. I mean, if it's 41 to Yamato coming into service, Yamato's not going to be in service quickly enough to engage Bismarck. Assuming any Italian battleships survive Taranto in some way, shape or form, the Japanese will probably be patrolling Yamato up and down the Mediterranean looking for a fight. Warlord Titan Tiberius, if the Japanese Admiralty or their equivalent had been able to persuade Yamamoto to cancel his complex two-prong attack at Midway and the Aleutians, instead focusing on refitting and capturing the Coral Sea area, plus cutting the flow of supplies to Australia, how would that have changed history? If the Japanese had gone for Coral Sea again, they probably would have had a lot more success. Because remember, one of the big problems they had at Midway was that they were trying to fight and engage Midway Island and its forces at the same time as they were trying to fight and engage the American carriers and their forces, and that kind of, well, obviously didn't go very well for them. Whereas if they have another go at Coral Sea with the full strength of the Kido Butai, not only do the Americans have to base themselves further forward, they also have that they don't have Midway's air support, and they, yes, and so the Yorktown may or may not be ready in time. I mean, it depends how long a delay. If it's a longer delay, Yorktown obviously might be more ready, but if it's a medium-term delay, you might actually not have Yorktown at all, because if there isn't an impending Japanese attack because they're preparing for another go at Coral Sea, Yorktown might then get stripped down so that they can fix its engines, at which point it won't be in a position where they can get it back out in 48 hours to go into action. And obviously the Americans go into action without support from Midway's air forces distracting the Japanese, so that would actually probably go a lot better for the Japanese. But as we saw with all the 1942 carrier battles, a lot of that is down to the pure luck of who can spot who first. Matt Clem, if you were Commander-in-Chief in the Pacific in World War II, what historically attacked islands would you have bypassed? Probably not the early ones, but certainly by the time you're getting into 44, when you're talking about things like Okinawa and Iwo Jima, you do need a forward air base to start bombing Japan, but I'd probably just start skipping and isolating a lot more of those islands. I'd identify which one do I want as an air base against Japan, hit that, isolate the rest, save the casualties, and starve out those islands and prepare to hit Japan in a big way. It's just not worth. It's not worth it at that point, at least to me. Animal 16365 again. You clone Captain Evans 1,000 times, build 1,000 Fletchers, and release them into the Pacific in early 1942. What would the outcome be? The coral reefs, formerly known as the Japanese Navy, is probably the outcome there. I mean, 1,000 Fletchers alone is just a massive problem. Rogue Leader asking what instances in World War II did tanks or anti-tank guns sink naval vessels, excluding subs. There was a tank engagement, I believe it was the Canadians, possibly, which fought and sank a bunch of German coastal forces. When it comes to anti-tank guns, I think it was either off Tripoli or Tobruk, one of some German 88mm guns caused some fairly critical damage to a British destroyer, but that was in conjunction with Italian shore batteries. And then you get into what exactly counts as a shore defense gun and what counts as an anti-tank gun pressed into service in the very specific islands by the Japanese, which is all a bit of a mess. Then we've got Dale Huff. Why did the USN use city names for cruisers and state names for battleships? Because they have a lot of cities and a lot of states, and those are pretty much the biggest things that they can name them for. Yeah, it's just a tradition. States are pretty much the single largest entity that the United States has that isn't the country. So if you're going to name your battleships after anything, it's going to be that. I mean, you look, a lot of nations do that. The French do it. The Germans, to a certain extent, do it. The Russians do occasionally, but not that often. The Italians do sometimes, but not that often. So yeah, it's definitely around as a thing. Ferris asks, much has been made of hypothetical matchups between various Axis and Allied powers, but what about Axis versus Axis? How would, say, Kido of Bataille have fared if, for whatever reason they decided to invade the Mediterranean and take on the Regia Marina? In pretty much any Axis versus Axis scenario, the Japanese win, ignoring logistics. Obviously, if the Japanese go to the Mediterranean, they don't have the logistics to actually fight there, but if for some reason, somehow, they manage to have fuel and supplies there, and it's just a straight-up fight, the Japanese Navy is just flat-out bigger. And they have carriers, and they have very well-trained pilots, so the Kriegsmarine would be an easier walkover than the Regia Marina, but the Regia Marina doesn't have aircraft carriers, it's outnumbered in capital ships, it's outnumbered in heavy cruisers, it's outnumbered in everything. And the Japanese are fairly well trained for night action, which, as Mataban showed, the Italians really weren't. Brian Roper, have you thought of doing an S ranking chart for major World War I admirals in each of the major navies during World War II by nation or as a whole? No, I haven't actually. Maybe I should think about doing that. Additionally, Brian Roper asks, his wife would like to ask, what is your favourite dinosaur and why? She thinks it's a travesty that just because someone is an adult, people assume they no longer have favourite dinosaurs anymore. She prefers duck-billed hadrosaurs, I'm a fan of pterosaurs, good man, and ichthyosaurs. Yes, I'm a fan of ichthyosaurs. I don't know if they technically count as dinosaurs anymore. Favourite dinosaur? I mean, there's always the T-Rex. I'd say there's 1, 2, 3, 4 T-Rexes up there. I am quite fond of the good old T-Rex. I do like Ichthyosaurus, although I kind of prefer Plesiosaurus to Ichthyosaurus. Ichthyosaurus is really nice, but see, the thing is, when I grew up, I got loads of the Invicta models from the Natural History Museum, and they had the dark blue plesiosaur they did was really nice. In terms of land dinosaurs outside of Tyrannosaurus Rex, I've always been a bit of a fan of the Stegosaurus. Mainly because it has a Thagomizer, which is just a wonderful name. Maybe I should bring the T-Rexes down at some point for the next stream. Cody Dunsmere, you've been given the task of building a navy for a nation with decent resources but limited manpower and a vast sea area to cover. What do you build? Depends on the era, but assuming we're talking about World War One, World War Two, probably battleships. Because if I've got a vast sea area to cover, it's going to be a mixture of battleships and very light cruisers, because heavy cruisers are crew intensive, but they can't stand in a battle line. Destroyers are fairly crew light, but you need massive amounts of them, which dilutes your manpower quite quickly. So yeah, small light cruisers for general area coverage, and battleships because they need less crew than battle cruisers and give me a lot of firepower for the number of men. Style Runner, you need to sink 100 first rates as quickly as possible with any one ship in service by the end of World War II. What are you taking? No aircraft allowed. An Atlanta, or yeah, probably an Atlanta loaded with HE. So Long John. If Turkey had declared war on Germany in World War II much earlier than 45, let's say 42, what impact would this have had on the Battle of the Mediterranean? That's an interesting one, actually. I'd be tempted to say not too much because of the general lack of firepower from the... Thank you very much, Alex H, by the way. For the general lack of firepower of the Turkish Navy, yes, they have an old Moltke-class battle cruiser, but that's probably not something you want to be taking out against the Italians. The single biggest impact, depending on whether or not Allied air forces could get to base in Turkey quick enough, might be that it secures an additional supply line to Russia via the Black Sea, but it depends on the time, on whereabouts, because obviously Stalingrad and Sevastopol are under siege for a good chunk of that period, so having a supply line there's not really going to help matters much. It's pretty much going to open up a new front, considering that Germany has invaded Greece. Although, given that you only have to hop across the Bosporus to hit the European mainland, it does potentially, if Turkey goes full on, might open up a possibility of some of the allies maybe looking at a land invasion to support Russia via that route, because then they don't have to get into massive amounts of sea lift and amphibious assault. And it also would stretch German defences a lot thinner, because if they're expecting an attack from... They have to then fortify the north coast of France, the south coast of France. Italy has to fortify Italy. And they're fighting the Russians. And they've now got to worry about an attack possibly from Turkey. So, yeah. Frank Battaglino asks, he says, long time man, thank you very much. Would you ever consider doing a Wednesday special on the history and development of HVAC and refrigeration on warships? It's my trade, and I would love to hear what our ocean-going counterparts had going on. Yeah, I think at some point it definitely would need a special on that. Refrigeration and air conditioning. I've been tempted to maybe include it as part of a video on logistics, but the more and more you look into it, the more and more you realise that, okay, it might end up being one of the short sort of 30-45 minute Wednesday videos, but it's enough information on its own that I would definitely have to put it in its own special. As for exactly when, that's a whole other matter. There's a very long list of videos at the moment to do. His Lordship, very alternate history. At the start of World War One, Horatio Nelson and Thomas Cochrane find themselves presenting themselves at the doors of the Admiralty. What does the Royal Navy do with them? At the same time, Martin Tromp and Michael de Ruyter present themselves to the Kaiserliche Marine, offering their services against the old foe. What do the Germans do with them? Get very confused because the Dutch were neutral. Just how transferable would the skills of old admirals be to a more modern age? Or if you prefer something more specific, how would Jutland have progressed if the battle cruiser fleet had been commanded by Cochrane and the Grand Fleet by Nelson? Well, for my views on Nelson, I think see the previous answer I gave earlier in this video. Cochrane was a very clever person, very adaptable, so I think he probably would have done pretty well in the battle cruiser fleet if he had had time to get up to speed on what's going on. Tromp and de Ruyter, again, they're very good admirals, but they are from considerably further back in time still. See, the thing is, when it comes to admirals, they're not the ones strictly so much dictating everything. The admirals are there to provide leadership, to provide overall tactical guidance, and all four of the men you've mentioned are brilliant admirals, brilliant leaders of men, and very good at the tactics of their era. I don't see any reason why, given sufficient crash course education, they wouldn't retain those capabilities to a fairly large degree in the modern era. Now, admittedly, some of Tromp and de Ruyter's skills especially involve trying to get the 7 states of the Netherlands to actually work together, which is somewhat less applicable in the Kaiserliche Marine, but still, they're also very good naval commanders. It would probably end up with a lot of court-martials, though, because all four would have a rather looser interpretation of what it means to follow orders as compared to some of their more modern counterparts. Alex Lewecki. That's a very nice message, thank you. I'm glad to have helped. He asks, were the Iowa and Montana designed to fight the Yamato? And if you were told to hunt the Bismarck, what ships would you take? Iowa and Montana, technically yes, but also no. They were designed to fight what the US Navy thought Yamato was going to be. They weren't so much designed to fight what Yamato actually was, even though, as I've mentioned in other videos, Montana would have been very well placed to fight against Yamato, and Iowa has a decent chance increasing the more weather effects, including night, get involved. So yeah, basically that. Not designed to fight actual Yamato, but designed to fight what the Americans thought Yamato was going to be. If you were told to hunt Bismarck, what ships would you take? Well, with the ships that were available to me at the time on the Allied side, you only really have a choice of what's in harbour, which would just effectively just be take the additional King George V. So take 3 battleships against 1. If I could pick from a pool across the world, I mean, Rodney demonstrated that if it can get in range, it can take a Bismarck apart, but Rodney is slower, and you at this point, Bismarck's operational at full speed, you need to be able to hunt it down, so that limits you to fast battleships. So you've got King George V's, you've got Hood. Don't really want to take Renown or Repulse, to be honest, unless they're sort of being the backstop to other heavier ships, so they won't really be engaged. North Carolina at this point still has massive issues with its propulsion system, so yeah, not that. Because again, it won't have the speed, and if it somehow gets up to the speed, it's not going to have the fire accuracy. I think pretty much in 1941, and Richelieu is not complete. In 1941, if I had to pick from anything across the world at the time of Bismarck sailing, pretty much the only other fast battleships that are in service that have both the speed, the firepower, and have actually been in commission long enough to know how to use their weapons properly would be the Littorios, but of course the Italians are on the German side. But if I could somehow nick the Littorios, then yeah, I'd take a Littorio against Bismarck quite happily. Trey Atkins, can we see a history and development of amphibious assault ships and landing vessels? Yes, eventually. But I have a feeling that would have to be a multi-part series. And as people keep reminding me, I have the Carriers and Destroyers series to complete. So, yeah, I will hold off until I've completed those series before I start in on them. Graham Andrew, Iowa class versus HMS Vanguard. Who wins 1v1? Battleship New Jersey channel recently did a balanced piece on this. What do you think? It's one of those things where top trumps type stats can be rather odd. Iowa definitely has an overall firepower advantage. It's got one extra gun and it's got 16-inch 50s. Vanguard is better protected generally. Vanguard actually has also a more redundant fire control system, and at the time of its launch, a slightly more up-to-date one. But that's simply because the Iowas have been launched a year or two before it, and technology is advancing that quickly. Obviously, Vanguard is better sea keeping. It can fire the supercharges, so its 15-inch guns do have a decent amount of penetration. Both are capable of fighting at night. Both are capable of fighting in poor visibility. The 15-inch 42 shell actually has a bigger bursting charge, so assuming that it hits an Iowa and actually gets in and explodes, it's actually going to do more damage than the 16-inch 50 shell, because the 16-inch 50 shell just doesn't have as much explosive aboard. But yeah, if you were just going to line them up and do a straight-up gunfight one against the other, then overall the Iowa's probably got the advantage, because Iowa has a bigger gun. Well, bigger gun means basically more penetration with the super heavy shell, and it's got an additional gun, which helps. Most of the other factors that you would usually use to sort of distinguish Vanguard or Iowa against most other ships are pretty much a wash. Speed, fire control, etc. Really, all you've got is the better seakeeping and thicker armor on Vanguard versus that slightly greater penetration on Iowa. If the seas are quite rough, then Vanguard is probably at more of an advantage, because it's going to be able to keep its guns firing for longer before in a higher sea state, whereas Iowa's probably going to start losing capacity from its forward guns. I do need to watch that video actually from the Battleship New Jersey. It's on my to watch list. So yeah, there are certain circumstances where Vanguard would have an advantage over Iowa, but generally speaking, in most normal circumstances, Iowa's probably got an edge up on Vanguard. But it would be one of those things where the odds are maybe sort of 60-40, 65-35, one way or the other. It wouldn't be an easy fight for either ship. I will have to see what Battleship New Jersey channel says about it, because that will be fairly interesting. If going back to the point I keep repeating, if the 16-inch 50 had been given a regular weight shell with a slightly bigger bursting charge, then that would take away one of the remaining advantages that Vanguard has. Archangel Glenn, assuming all crews are equally trained, who would win in a fight between King George V, Bismarck, and Littorio? Assuming all crews are equally trained, so if by that we're taking everything is the equal, apart from the technical capabilities of the ships. If that includes Italian shell quality being negated as an issue, I'd probably actually give it to Littorio. If the shell quality issues are still in place, then it's a much more difficult question. But if the Italian shell quality is fixed, then I'm going to go with Littorio there. It's just got very nice guns, very, very nice range finding. Daryl Smith, is there one question you'd like to answer but no one has asked? Oh, that's To be honest, you guys have been pretty good about asking interesting questions. Question I'd like to answer, but no one has asked. Thing is, whatever I say, I'm now going to see massively spammed in the chat, aren't I? I don't think I've pinned down a specific one, but if I was going to say any particular question would probably be, or genre of questions would be more questions about the 1870s and 1880s ironclads, because it genuinely is a very interesting era. And I don't think it gets covered enough. Daniel the Historian. Views on the decommission of HMS Bristol. I'll come back to that if I remember. We're still almost done with the Patreon questions, so then I can start taking things, lifting them straight out of the chat. Captain Landlocked, what would Drac do? Would you rather fight one Yamato-sized motor torpedo boat or 100 motor torpedo boat-sized Yamatos? The motor torpedo boat-sized Yamatos, because their guns are going to be hilariously tiny. Like a destroyer, a Dido, or an Atlanta would just scythe through them at range, whereas a Yamato-sized motor torpedo boat would be firing a torpedo the size of a small cruiser at me, which would be terrifying. At that point, it wouldn't matter if it missed. It would just have to have a proximity fuse, and it would still be utterly devastating. Lily asks... two question option. Okay. USS Merrimack as converted, so CSS Virginia, versus General Sherman landing a platoon of Shermans of the M4A3 75mm variety. Assuming wide river lake environment with modest islands, the Shermans are trapped on until it's safe to snorkel, but the ironclad can't escape range due to low tide. What changes if you had one or more 76mm gun tanks or 105mm support tanks? Okay, that is unusual. I'm going to give it to the Shermans. Some of the bigger guns on the Virginia would properly mess up a Sherman if they hit, but they're not particularly accurate, whereas a Sherman, especially a stationary Sherman, is going to be hard-pressed to miss something the size of Merrimack. And the guns, okay, maybe the 75 mils might have some issues getting through some of Merrimack's armour, but then again, maybe not, is iron instead of steel. But more to the point is that in that kind of engagement, the Shermans can start targeting things like gun ports, and eventually, with the amount of firepower that a platoon of Shermans would have, they just eventually start breaking bits off of Virginia long before I think Virginia would actually start to land hits on them, especially because if the fire gets too close, they just move and reset the whole problem. Derp Squad plays Praise be to the most glorious and divine Blackburn. If someone can find a model kit that's on sale for the Blackburn, I will, in an act of probably model as self-flagellation, buy and build one. If someone can link me to a model kit of it. Now I'm just hoping no one's ever made one. Stal Runner, what were the interiors of the Queen Anne's mansions like? Are there photos or floor plans available? There are floor plans. It depends if you mean the actual Queen Anne's mansions in London, or the superstructure that took the nickname from it. If you're talking about the superstructure, there are plans available for a number of warships that had it. In terms of photos, there are a few photos around, mostly of the bridge, to be honest. I don't know about the actual structures in London, though. Graham R. Battle of Savo Island. Had the US been trained with their radar and had decent command structures? If Chicago had had its radar on and the operators knew how to use it, that would have been a very, very different battle. with the limitations of radar at the time being relatively short range, they would have spotted the Japanese still at fairly close range. Probably the Japanese would have seen them already, but they wouldn't be expecting them to react that quickly. The Japanese probably still would have been dropping long lances in the water, but if the Canberra and Chicago had managed to get up to speed quicker and get fully operational, it would have been an interesting running gunfight, I think. They're still heavily outnumbered, and obviously there is a chance of the long lances doing a number to them very quickly. But if they're able to get up to speed, get their guns trained out, and exchange fire with the Japanese cruisers, whilst they probably would overall be on a losing streak, they would last a lot longer, and also they'd be motoring off towards the next cruiser group with Quincy, Astoria, and Vincennes, who would hopefully have realised what was going on and been coming to meet them. And I think they, barring surprise long lance strikes, I think Canberra and Chicago certainly could have survived long enough to get the other 3 heavy cruisers into the action along with the accompanying destroyers. And once those 2 forces have joined together, they probably, between radar, searchlights, etc., they've probably got the firepower to see off the Japanese. Neil Murray. Oh, this is a bit of a sober question. How frequently did sailors get sealed into watertight compartments to drown? It happened more often than you'd like to think about. The sailors do try and keep their comrades alive, and there were instances where water did get in further into ships than was strictly necessary under pure damage control regulations because they were trying to get men out. But at the end of the day, if you're trying to save a ship with thousands of men on it, then unfortunately the lives of a few dozen don't really measure up to that. So it did happen. In terms of could they only be open from one side, well, you've got 2 problems. One is that the watertight doors can be locked, and so when they're locked you're not going to get them open. The other thing is that water pressure, once the water's built up to a certain height on one side, the pressure it's going to be exerting on that door means you're not going to get it open anyway. Unfortunately, not until you pump it out. Archangel Glenn, I know they don't get much viewing, but could you sometime do a video on Royal Navy aviation in World War II? Yes, I can. I've actually been down to the Royal Naval Air Museum in Yeovilton a couple of times in the past couple of weeks. And so I've been taking some photos there, and I plan to be going down there at least once more to get content to cover that period precisely. Also, they have the gloriousness of a canvas and wood World War I biplane that's been fitted with a massive rocket battery to hunt Zeppelins. And you can't not tell the story of that. So we've got 2 more Patreon questions. Darren Liu, say you're magically transported back in time with all your modern knowledge to 1900 and stuck as chief of the Imperial Japanese Navy. How would you guide its actions and development to ensure the survival of the Japanese Empire past 1945, assuming world affairs outside the Asia-Pacific region remain more or less along the historical trajectory? What would be the main turning points where this will go completely off the rails and your historical knowledge become useless? My historical knowledge is probably going to go off the rails shortly after World War I because, I mean, as the chief of the Japanese Navy, I don't have, obviously, the power of the Japanese, either political head of state or the emperor. So there's a limited amount I can do, but what I would probably do is lobby much harder with everyone to send much more significant elements of the Japanese fleet to help out the British, who at this point are my allies in World War One. The Russo-Japanese War, aside from pointing out where a couple of the their ships are going to run afoul of mines doesn't really need much interference from me. They've won that pretty handily. The reason I would be sending a significant chunks of my Japanese forces to help the British in World War One, especially maybe lend them a Congo or two for Jutland, would be that the more and more I can tie myself into some big victories there, and the more and more I can make myself seem very useful and very helpful to the British, there's still a chance I might be thrown under the bus at the Washington Naval Treaty, but it's reduced quite significantly. And it also builds up a more modern combat experience. Now, when it comes to then the Washington Treaty era, then it's more likely that I can argue for not necessarily a 15-15-10, but maybe a 15-15-11 or a 5-5-3.5 type ratio, which is just a little bit more. It's just about within affordability, and it gives me a slightly more, slightly greater bit of leverage when it comes to the Pacific War. Now, the thing is, when it comes to the things like the invasion of China, that's not in my power to control as head of the Imperial Japanese Navy. I can make arguments for or against it, but the thing is, Japan as an industrial power, if politics are going to drag me into a war with China, as the Navy, I can't do an awful lot about that, and the fact that Japan is continuing a war with China means that it is inevitably going to come into conflict with the United States, at which point the best I can do is make the best of a bad decision when war with the US inevitably breaks out, at which point the butterflies have probably already departed too much from my historical knowledge to be of all that much use, but I can kind of reflect what the American attitude and general tactics probably are going to be beyond what the Japanese obviously think they might be. But all that really does is slow down the inevitable juggernaut. It's not gonna help me win the war. But I might be starting off with a stronger position, and I might be able to make it last longer. Yeah, unfortunately, it's one of those positions where you can do a certain amount to change the course of history, but you just don't quite have the political power to make the decisions that you really would want to. Last Patreon question, Jonathan Welsh. What if Admiral Scott commanded the task force on the night of November 13th instead of Admiral Callahan? Would the results of the battle have been different with Scott's previous naval combat experience? Yeah, probably. I mean, each admiral has their own command styles, and Scott will now make fewer mistakes, hopefully. But exactly how that would go down, the problem with any of the night actions in the Guadalcanal campaign is everything is so varied. Just by starting off with an Allied advantage, like spotting the Japanese sooner and opening fire sooner, the Japanese response to that, probably dump long lances and return fire. That could change the outcome so dramatically, because it could be anything from the long lances go sailing off and nobody notices them, and it's sort of a huge Allied victory, to everyone engages in long-range gunfire and they're so focused on that no one notices the long lances until things start blowing up and it actually ends up being worse. That's the thing. When you've got lots of long lances dumped into the waters at night, almost anything can be changed by that. So, yeah. In theory, you would think hopefully it should come out better for the Allies, but there are also multiple scenarios where it might not. So that's the Patreon questions that were left over. If you are a patron and your question either hasn't been covered in this Drydock or and hasn't been covered in the pre-recorded version of the Drydock, I don't know how that's happened because I thought I'd noted them all down, but if it has happened, then please do drop me a line. At some point, you know how. Pick up a couple of more questions here, and then we're going straight into the general chat. Code Monkey, if Shear and Jellicoe met after World War One, what's the first question do you think Shear would ask? My guess is why Jellicoe did not push past the torpedo screen and destroy the high seas fleet. Possibly. I actually think if it was about tactics and the events of Jutland, I think probably the first question he'd ask is, how on earth did you not realise that we were cutting in behind you at night? And, well, actually, and then probably further beyond that would be, how did you know we were coming out in the first place? Yeah. Style Runner, how did South Dakota manage to avoid getting torpedoed during her power outage? Her engines were still working. Also at night, it is surprisingly difficult in a close fortnight action to land torpedo hits. You look at Savo Island. There were a number of torpedo hits, but look at the number of torpedoes that were launched. And there were other US ships fighting there. And once Washington showed up, everyone was very distracted. So yeah, it's some of it will have been a bit of luck, because there would have been torpedoes launched at it that just missed. But some of it as well would have been, it was engaged, well, or once the power valve was being engaged in a gunnery duel, and ships tend to either launch torpedoes, then engage in gunnery, or engage in gunnery and then launch torpedoes. They don't tend to mix and match between the two all the way along. Right. Coltax 100. Scharnhorst and Gneisenau versus Dunkirk and Strasbourg. I think I've talked about this before. I'd give, just very slightly, I'd give the edge to the Scharnhorsts. Strasbourg 1-on-1, I would give the advantage to Strasbourg, but Dunkirk is less well protected. And there were a few other changes made to Strasbourg because of the Scharnhorsts. So in a 2v2, it's slightly more likely that Dunkirk would lose to whichever of the Scharnhorst it's fighting, which then means Strasbourg gets ganged up 2-on-1, which isn't good. If you had two Strasbourgs versus the two Scharnhorst, then I'd definitely give the advantage to the Strasbourgs. But as with all these kind of very close run naval things, you could also have Strasbourg landing some crippling hits pretty quickly. And, of course, they actually do have the advantage. They can go not fully bow in, but they can minimise their profile by angling very, very strongly. Which, again, it's not so much about increasing your armour profile, although that does happen a little bit. It's more about reducing your overall target silhouette. And they can still use their entire main battery to do so. Whereas the Scharnhorst obviously can't. If they do the same thing, it's now 6 guns versus 8. And that favours the French. Grand Admiral Foxtel 11 Naval 1918 asks, can you do a 5-minute guide on British or Australian minesweepers or mine layers? I'd have to do 5-minute guides on multiple classes of Australian and British minesweepers and mine layers. So there would be multiple 5-minute guides involved there. So yes, I can. It's just a matter of where they may sit in the list. And to be honest, I'll probably also cover them in some amount when I get round to doing a Wednesday special on minesweepers and mine layers in general. Trent McCartney, standing 1 and 2 mile battleship drag race, the fastest Iowa versus the fastest Congo versus the faster of the two Scharnhorst versus Vanguard. Who wins? If it's a standing start drag race, that is an interesting one, actually. Iowa's got by far the most power, but it's also got the greatest mass and therefore the most inertia. I'd still be tempted to give it to Iowa, though, just that sheer amount of power. and the fact it's got a higher top speed. Because the thing is, when you look at the power curves and the speed curves of ships, they tend to go up they tend to accelerate very, very quickly, up to about 80-90% of their speed, and then that last few knots kind of tails off, and it takes a lot longer to reach that last bit. So with Iowa probably having realistically the highest top speed in a calm sea, it's going to get up to a higher speed faster than the others. So I'd probably give that to Iowa. I'd probably give that to Iowa. The Congo's being relatively low mass compared to all the others, and having an insane amount of power, might have a shot in there as well. But I wouldn't necessarily count on it. Kyle Hardman, is the poster with the swordfish available still? This one. Yes, it is. It's on the Etsy shop link in the video description of every video. There's a whole pile of them over there, just down there. Only the A4 ones are left, though, and all the A3 ones were sold out. Questions are coming in so fast they keep jumping, so I'm just going to take as many as possible. Michael Highgate, why did the Royal Navy keep the fairy swordfish for as long as they did? Good old Stabby there. Why did they keep it for as long as they did? Basically, lack of anything better. The ostensible replacement for the swordfish was the albacore, and it turned out the albacore was worse. So, apart from having an enclosed cockpit, so the swordfish actually outlasted the albacore. The barracuda was all right. I mean, technically speaking, the barracuda is a overall better torpedo bomber than the swordfish, but the swordfish could be used from a lot more smaller craft. So you could get a barracuda on an escort carrier, but you could get a swordfish on an escort carrier a lot easier, and its relatively slow speed, did actually make it quite suitable for long-term reconnaissance for things like anti-submarine warfare. So it still had a number of uses, even when the primary torpedo strike role had maybe been subordinated by the barracuda to a certain degree. The guy that everybody likes asks, given their issues, how would the Kaiserliche und Königliche... No. Yeah, Kaiserliche und Königliche Kriegsmarine, the Austro-Hungarian Navy, for those of you who don't know what that means, how could they have made the Tegethoff class work on about the same tonnage? Some of the Tegethoffs did work. So it's basically a case of, and obviously this is never going to happen in a realistic Austro-Hungarian Empire, but it's basically a case of identifying the shipyards that actually know what they're doing and get them to build the entire class, rather than sort of parcel them out for political, national purposes and ending up with one of them being built in a yard that's never built anything bigger than a destroyer before. Marco Rivigatna... Oh, I apologise. Marco Rivignani Vaccari asks, what if Italian shells work properly during World War II? That's one of the most popular questions I think ever gets asked. There's as I've said before, there would be a lot more dead Royal Navy ships. The Italians were known for consistently having good gunnery in terms of range finding. It's just the shells dispersion was awful. So would the Royal Navy have lost control of the Mediterranean? Depends on how some of the engagements go, but possibly. At least it depends if the Royal Navy, when their ships are hit, they withdraw, or whether they keep fighting and lose them. If they lose ships, then they could potentially lose control of the Mediterranean for a while. but they would at least at the minimum be on the back foot. Ayobaranya asks, if infrastructure, time and money allowed, how far would each country have taken the battleship and battlecruiser concept? I think, as I said before, 18-inch guns are probably a practical limit. 20-inch guns you can make work, but there's going to be diminishing rates of return. And for infrastructure reasons, probably ships around the 1,000-foot or so mark are probably going to be the upper limit of what you're going to see. At that point, it'll just be multiplying numbers of guns and thickness of armour. Lucas Janschk asks, how much influence did the Kiel Canal have on German ship design? The Kiel Canal had a fairly big influence on German ship design. It kind of had the inverse problem to the Panama Canal. The Panama Canal does have some depth issues, but the main constraint is the width of the lock gates. The Kiel Canal is very, very, very wide, but it's not quite as deep as some. So it did have a certain influence on German warship design because they had to think about the draft more than the beam. And I mean, there are a number of reasons why the Bismarck class are so wide relative to their draft, but that's one of them. They wanted a very stable gun platform as well, and I covered the strengths and weaknesses of that particular aspect of the design elsewhere. But yeah, it did affect their designs to a certain extent, but it wasn't quite the same constraint on beam that the Panama Canal locks were. Elm99, what if the US Navy had 3 Essex class carriers instead of the Yorktowns at the time of Pearl Harbor? Well, it wouldn't have affected Pearl Harbor all that much because they just weren't there. If you get to Coral Sea and Midway, they're bigger, so they can absorb a little bit more damage, but say the hit that knocked out some of Yorktown's power plant is probably going to have a similar effect on the Essexes. The main thing that the Essexes are going to have is they're going to be able to deploy a larger air group. So that's an advantage, although an air group made up of devastators, they're not as bad as is entirely made out in Midway, but they are not the best. The main thing that was affecting US Navy carrier effectiveness in 42 was not so much the carriers themselves, because if you look at like Enterprise and Saratoga, they continue to be highly effective fighting units all the way through World War II. It was more the US Navy doing a crash course lesson in how to fight a carrier war. The Essex, as I say, with their slightly larger air group and slightly more anti-aircraft defences, would help slightly in that respect, but it's more the expertise that they're needing to get up to speed on. Miles McCaskill, what's Warpite's approximate scorecard, number and types of ships sunk and damaged, and are you able to increase the character limit on super chat questions, currently 200? Warpite's approximate scorecard, that's a very good question. I'd actually have to look into that. Because it was involving quite a lot of different engagements. I think I did look into this for a Drydock question in the past, but I can't remember off the top of my head. So drop me a line via email, Discord, or whatever, and I'll try and get that information back to you at some point in the next few days. Can I increase the character limit on super chat questions? I don't know. Is the answer. I'll have a look and see if I can for the next live stream. I genuinely don't know. I've got about half a glass of Iron Brew left, and we're running okay, actually. We're coming up to 2 hours, so we should be all right. Stalrunner, was there a sense of superiority amongst crews of newer and better ships over the crews of older ones, like the crews of the Iowas over the crews of the Standards? It's back and forth in most navies. The crew of a new ship, it's big, theoretically it's bigger, it's better, it's newer, it's shinier, it has all the mod cons, etc. At the same time, the crew of the older ship, they're not green, they're veteran, they know how to handle their ship, they've got quite a lot of affection for their ship because they'll have seen them through rough times and rough seas. So both sides would be, I think both sides would, when it comes to old ships versus new ships, would have a certain amount, would have a lot of pride in their vessels for different reasons. But yeah, I think on any happy ship, you were probably going to think your ship is the best ship in the Navy, whether it's old, new, destroyer, or battleship. And of course, from your perspective, you'd be completely right. Andreas Person. I noticed we're running a bit short on the list of 5-minute guides. Should we start suggesting more, and where? Can I suggest Schleswig-Holstein, you evil, evil person? Yes, you can. So when it comes to the 5-minute guide list, I am actually going to be covering this in the Drydock that's going to be released on Sunday. But basically what it comes down to is I'm not running out of ships. There's about 8 or 9 years worth of 5-minute guides on a Word document. I haven't written them all, but the class and ship names are there. But what happened was, at some point a couple of years ago, I realised the list was getting so long, the video description was just getting stupidly long. So I decided I was going to cut off the list as it was shown on YouTube and just keep adding to the list offline. And just let it run out, and then when it runs out, which will probably be some point around the end of the year, I'll just import the next 52 ship classes or names in and start the list, and it'll sort of not start over again, but you know what I mean, it'll be the next batch of stuff. Basically, when someone suggests, can you cover X ship or X class of ship in the comments, I always go and add it to that list. So please keep adding suggestions in the comments, ideally in the Q&A section, and then it'll get added to the list. The only rule I have, apart from the obvious sort of 1950 cutoff date, is that I will generally I try not to cover a specific ship until I've covered the class. So if let's say because there have been a lot of individual requests for different individual destroyers in the US Navy. That's probably not the best example because I have covered the Fletchers and the Gearings already. But let's say I think I've done the Northamptons. I think I've done the Pensacola's. Oh boy, I'm then now trying to think of ships I haven't done. Wyoming's? No. Okay, Florida class. That's what I'm pretty sure I haven't done the Florida class. But let's say someone asked me to cover USS Florida specifically, then I would release a 5-minute guide on the Florida class and then go on to do USS Florida. Or the Baltimore, the Des Moines class. So if I was going to do a video on USS Salem, for example, I would do a video on the Des Moines first. And that might obviously then bump a specific ship a little bit further down the line. Cotton Cat asks, how would the Battle of Leyte have ended if the ships present had World of Warships gimmicks, 19-point captains, and were all controlled by Flamu? Well, I don't know about poor old Flamu having to split his mind into 4 dozen different captains, but you could try and recreate it. If you're going to give him World of Warships gimmicks, including tiering and 19-point captains, I suppose you could try and recreate the Battle of Samar in World of Warships. Maybe in a training room. I think you probably actually end up maxing out one side with the Japanese, but that would be interesting. Mr. Fish, I read somewhere that British were replacing their 20mm with 30mm single pom-poms by the end of the war. Is this true, and how effective was it? And if you were sent back King George V and its equivalents back to the start of the Dreadnought race, how would that affect the race? I don't think they were using 30mm single pom-poms. They were certainly replacing all the 20 mils with 40 mils. And that was because basically the 20 mil could, as actually the Enterprise's after action report was pointing out, the smaller caliber light AA couldn't take down aircraft before they dropped their bomb or torpedo, but it could savage them once they'd done so. And with the 40mm pom-poms and 40mm Bofors available, it made more sense to just replace the 20mm Oerlikons, because weapons were getting to a stage where they were a lot more lethal. So you could, if you had more 40mm, you could take the aircraft down before they dropped the weapon, which is obviously a lot better than letting the aircraft drop the weapon and then taking it down. Cascadian, any chance of doing a video on the Jeune École doctrine like you did with the Kantai-Kessen video? Yes, I do actually have a video lined up to talk about French pre-dreadnought doctrine. I was sent a very, very nice research paper, which I do intend to incorporate elements of into the video. It's just there's a huge list of Wednesday videos, so it's probably not going to happen until next year. Well, it's definitely not going to happen until next year, because I know pretty much all the Wednesday videos I'm going to be producing this year already. Going back to Mr. Fisher's question, if you sent back King George V and its equivalents to the start of the Dreadnought race, so equivalents, so we're talking about everyone's treaty era battleships, how would it affect the race? Ooh, it would scare the living daylights out of everybody, because you've just got on to sort of high teens, low 20,000 tons, and then all of a sudden you've got 35,000 ton monsters with much more advanced fire control systems and what for the time would seem to be monstrous guns. Everyone would be trying to rip it apart, reverse engineer it, and then figure out how they could build them themselves. 5101 and lots of different Japanese or possibly Chinese characters. What will happen if BT is commanding an Omaha-class scout cruiser? Nothing good. Well, actually, I say nothing good. Probably an explosion, which may or may not be good depending on your point of view. I think someone's trying to deliver some fast food at the door, so give me a minute and I will be back with you as soon as possible. Alright, I am back. Aaron Butler, do you think there would have been a major difference to the Pacific theatre strategy if the US had reinforced and defended Wake Island? They did reinforce and defend it to a certain degree. The Marines with their 5-inch guns certainly gave the Japanese a bit of a rude surprise. To be honest, though, in the early part of 42, there's a limited amount they can do to reinforce and defend Wake Island, and the Japanese are kind of on the ascendant there, so it might have delayed the Japanese advance a little bit if they have to come back quite a few different times to take out Wake Island. But in the end, it's probably not going to make a massive amount of difference. Archangel Glenn, I don't know if you got my earlier question, so I'll ask again. How would an extra 2,000 pounds of displacement have affected the Hornet? I'm assuming you mean 2,000 tons, because 2,000 pounds is nothing. And no, I didn't see that one earlier. How would it have affected Hornet? Now that's a good one. An extra 2,000 tons for a Yorktown. You're beginning to approach the displacement levels of the bigger carrier design that they were actually looking at, which might incorporate a bit more protection and would have been considerably larger. It's not quite an Essex, but Hornet would have kind of been a stepping stone, if you like, between the Yorktowns and the Essexes. I suspect they probably would have put a fair bit of that actually into increased protective measures, torpedo defense, for example, more AA guns. So it would have been a marginal increase in size, sort of kind of rounding out a few odds and ends here and there on the Yorktown design, but probably not massively bigger, but considerably better defenses. Mr. Fish also gives a qualification. The Brits replacing 20mm with 40mm single pom-poms by the end of the war. Is it true and would have been effective? Yes. They were replacing the 20mm with the 40mm pom-poms and 40mm Bofors. As I said, this basically because the additional range and hitting power of 40mm weapons, whether they be pom-poms or Bofors, and the British were quite happily using both, they would, as I said, they would take out attacking aircraft at a longer range. And also, to be perfectly honest, because you can fit so many 20mm Oerlikons everywhere, and now you're having to deal with radar and all those other systems affecting stability as well, the sheer number of crew that you needed to man the 20mm were getting quite ridiculous and overcrowding the ship and causing stability issues, especially when factored in with all the other permutations of stuff, like I say, with radar. So having fewer 40mm not only gave you a considerably better medium distance punch against incoming aircraft, but it also meant you actually needed fewer men, which relieved some of the pressure on both accommodation and weight on ships that really needed to be able to relieve the accommodation and weight. Stalrun has asked the superiority between crews of newer and better ships and crews of older ones. I think I answered that earlier. In fact, I'm 99% sure I answered that a little bit ago. So yeah, see my previous answer, hopefully. Scooter GSP, you're creating a naval force. Your choice of any era or country. What fictional crew members, any genre or franchise, do you assign to which positions? Oh. Naval force, era and country. Fictional crew members. Okay. I'm going to go with a Napoleonic era naval force. And I'm going to assign Captain Sisko as the Admiral of the fleet, because that's going to be hilarious. He's just going to run around punching everybody, so he'd do excellently in boarding actions. Yeah, so he's going to lead the fleet at sea. I'm going to have John Sheridan as the overall commander of the fleet, formulating the tactics and the strategies, etc. And then I'm probably going to take... Yes, you've got to give a small frigate or maybe a fifth rate or something like that to the SG1 team. I mean, they don't know much about how to captain a sailing ship, but I'm sure they can get some use out of it, and they would be perfect for voyages of exploration around the world. Yeah. What do I put in research and development? Not sure. I'll have to ponder that one a bit more. Guilty of bias, the 8-8 first asks, if the Japanese had managed to beach Yamato on Iwo Jima, how would she have fared against boarding action by Marines? I believe I covered this in a dry dock. I did cover this in a dry dock relatively earlier, and basically she would have held out for a while, but she would have been the major focus. Well, to be honest, she would have been the major focus of shore bombardment. But if for whatever reason they had decided to board her, it would have been a very long and bloody struggle, which may or may not have ended up with the Japanese setting off their own magazines, but they would have ended up with the Marines would have definitely made a very good effort at trying to take the ship. A person who says, you may call me George, and very well, I will call you George, because I'm not announcing that name properly. In honour of Movember, any insights on the norms or attitudes regarding beards and moustaches in the World War I or II Royal Navy or other navies? The Royal Navy's standards, I believe, haven't changed all that much, which is basically, if you want to, if I remember correctly, it's if you want to grow facial hair, you have to grow a full beard and moustache, and then you get inspected, and if it's adequate, you get allowed to. If not, you have to stay clean shaven. The rules about being smart and presentable with facial hair have a fairly long history, but it is interesting actually when you look at, say, the 19th century standards for facial hair. There was a lot more of it, and one of the main reasons that it kind of disappears a lot in, actually it's a fairly interesting point overall, in general society in the early 20th century, and the military specifically, especially the army, and not to so great an extent the navy, but even then, partly there's just slightly changing fashions, but a lot of it is actually also to do with gas, because with a full beard and a World War I era gas mask, you're not going to get a proper gas tight seal, so everyone has to shave. Moustaches can be allowed because they sit inside the gas mask, and so therefore to be clean shaven is you're ready for combat, ready to fight, which is a big turnaround from pretty much very, very much further back, where having a beard was seen as, and facial hair generally was seen as, like, you are a mature and experienced person. Now, if you had a beard, you were, especially in World War I, you were almost shirking your duty because you're making yourself ineligible to fight. As I say, the Navy, it doesn't quite go to that kind of extreme as much, because ships aren't as at much risk of gas, and there's a mixture of beard or not in the Navy anyway already. But you can find images of bearded and mustachioed naval officers in World War I and II. So it is there. Stalrunner asks, 3-inch 50 caliber with VT fuses replaces Bofors in early 1943. How much of a difference would that make? A lot. A lot. I mean, if they can get the guidance working on them, a 3-inch 50 with VT fuses is going to be able to reach out and start mowing through incoming formations much, much, much earlier than even the Bofors can. And it actually does make overall fleet defense a lot easier, because the 20 mils are very definitely last-ditch defense for your own ship. The 40 mils are mostly last-ditch defense for your own ship, although if you're on close formation, you can kind of cover vectors in on another ship. But it's the 4.5s and the 5-inch and the 5.25 inch that are the guns that you can use from what to cover another ship from a separate ship. Whereas if you've got 3-inch 50s in a big way present, then a lot of ships can now offer significant medium high AA firepower to cover the entire fleet, which vastly increases the lethality of an AA barrage that's covering a particular ship that's under attack. So that would scythe through an awful lot of incoming attacks and prevent an awful lot of damage to quite a lot of different ships. HMS King George V. Out of all modern battleship classes in World War II, which one had the best and worst torpedo protection? If you had full control over the design of King George V class, what sort of changes would you implement? Torpedo protection is one of those very, very weird things. I mean, torpedo protection to a certain degree is dependent on sheer mass and sheer size. So whilst there may be faults in the system itself, just having a ship that's so massive like Yamato in and of itself gives you a bunch of very, very strong protection, because there's just so much mass to absorb the impacts. Whereas you can have the world's most advanced torpedo defense system, but if your ship is 20,000 tons, there's not a tremendous amount of space that you can actually put in there. And then, of course, you have the fact that torpedo defense systems narrow when you get closer to either end of the ship and then disappear entirely, and so you get lots of torpedo hits that hit outside of a ship's torpedo defense system, which then appear to reflect badly on their defenses, when in fact they don't. It's just the fact that they're hit either in a narrow or non-existent area of the torpedo defense. If I recall correctly, theoretically, the King George V's torpedo defense system amidships is designed against the heaviest of the warhead of all the torpedo defense systems, if I remember correctly, because I have a distinct feeling they were designed against a 1,000-pound torpedo warhead and everyone else was in the hundreds. But I would have to double check that figure. But as I say, every torpedo defense system ends up having strengths and weaknesses beyond what the designers intended. So, for example, Iowa's torpedo defense system, which was inherited to a certain degree from the South Dakotas and the North Carolinas, is generally good, but it does have a couple of big weaknesses that they hadn't thought about and which they were going to rectify in Kentucky, but obviously didn't get the chance because it wasn't completed. And similarly with the North Carolinas and South Dakotas, it was sort of generally good, but they did manage to identify and spot some fairly big Achilles heels in it. The Littorio with the Pugliese system, there's all sorts of arguments back and forth about the effectiveness or not of that and why that may or may not be, etc., 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 and so on as it goes. Unfortunately, because of the somewhat random nature of torpedo hits, and also the fact that not all torpedoes are created equal, a torpedo defense system that takes a hit from an aerial torpedo dead amidships, which is generally going to be lighter, should normally stand up fairly well, whereas a torpedo defense system that gets hit towards a narrower part of it by a submarine launched torpedo, which is obviously necessarily quite a lot heavier, or a long lance, say, is going to exhibit a lot worse performance, even if, strictly speaking, the actual pound-for-pound effectiveness of the torpedo system in the latter case might actually be better. So it would probably involve having to break down every single torpedo hit on every single battleship, compare and contrast warhead size, depth at impact, where did it hit along the torpedo defense system, was the defense system at full depth, was it at partial depth, etc., etc., which would be a very involved piece of work and be a very interesting paper to read. I'd love to do it if I had the time. That's the last of the Iron Brute, so as of now the stream will continue until I have difficulty speaking, which I believe is the traditional way of how the stream ends. Dan Haas asks, assuming an isolationist US at the start of World War II, what forces would the Royal Navy have available to contest the Japanese offensive into Southeast Asia, would the Japanese be able to cut trade routes to Australia? If it's an isolationist US, if the Japanese are making their offensive in 1942, early 42, as they did historically, you pretty much see what the Royal Navy had available there anyway, because they're tied up with the Germans and the Italians. So they're not going to be able to send all that much there. In fact, if the US is isolationist and they don't think the Japanese are going to be partially distracted going up against them, they might actually send less, because there's no point in sending Prince of Wales and Repulse, because they know that Prince of Wales and Repulse can't take on the entire Japanese Navy. The idea of them is to be a thorn in the side of the Japanese Navy and distract and divide them while they're also trying to deal with the US Navy. If the US isn't involved, then why not? Then they don't. There's not much point in doing it. Whether or not the Japanese will be able to cut trade routes to Australia, yeah, eventually, probably. But it would take them some time, just because they've got to physically advance and take the various positions and islands and land masses to get close enough for their navy to start interdicting the Australian trade routes. Albeit that, because of its sheer size, ships coming to and from Australia could just head south along the Australian coast and then down through the southern Indian Ocean, maybe past either cut back up again to the Suez Canal or keep going past South Africa. So whilst the traditional trade routes to and from Australia may be able to be cut, unless the Japanese go full on and invade Australia, they're probably not going to be cutting off trade routes, period. Cascadian, any idea of doing a video on Stalin's big fleet plan like you did with Plan Z and how it would have compared with other navies of the time? Yeah, at some point. I do have a few books which go over Stalin's plans. It's more about coming up with a synthesis for them, because, as you might appreciate, information on Stalin's plans is somewhat only really shows up post end of the Cold War. Bootle Spick. If you could somehow resurrect one ship from each major naval power from World War II that was either sunk or scrapped, what would you like to see as a museum ship? What warship would that be? Well, if we're going to go with each naval power from World War II specifically, I mean, Britain is going to be Warspite, obviously. America's going to be Enterprise. Germany, if it's World War II, I'd probably go with Scharnhorst. Italy, keep a Littoria around. They look really good. France, I'd probably keep Strasbourg, actually. I think Strasbourg's a lot more interesting than Richelieu. Richelieu is nice and big and certainly looks very nice, but yes, Strasbourg like Scharnhorst, represents a very interesting era, which would be covered by other treaty-era battleships in Richelieu's case. The Russians keep October Revolution, because that refit was just crazy. Scooter GSP, was Germany completely unaware of what was taking place at Bletchley Park, with no massive bombing campaign to destroy the assets there, or if this had occurred, what would be the ramifications? They knew that you had British counterintelligence efforts, obviously, but they had no idea what Bletchley Park was doing with taking apart the Enigma code. Some officers did have kind of hints, and they had a certain degree of understanding that something was going on, but they didn't know where. If they'd blown up Bletchley Park, it would have depended on how much warning. If it had been a sort of a sudden strike out of the blue by, I think it's pronounced Yabo fighter bombers, sort of converted BF-110s and stuff, spelt Jabo, They probably could have scored direct hits on the building on the first raid, which would have been devastating. Whereas if they'd tried it with normal level bombing, probably the first level bombing might have not have done too much damage, and that would have given the Allies a clue and some time to get their code breakers and their machines somewhere else that was a bit safer. Coltax 100, how realistic are the German carriers in World of Warships, and how effective would they be in real life? I haven't played them all that much yet, so haven't played them or played against. Yeah, basically I don't have enough experience with them at the moment to say one way or another, other than obviously the fact the Germans didn't have any carriers. I've got Graf Zeppelin, but I haven't played it all that much, and to be honest, I have it built in the crazy secondary battery. I'm now a cruiser mode, so yeah, come back to me when I've had a chance to go up against them and etc. a bit more. Thomas Gray, favourite World War I battle cruiser? Derflinger. It's a really nice balanced ship. I mean, Renown is technically World War One, but Renown in her World War One state is nothing like Renown in her World War Two state. So yeah, favourite World War One battle cruiser, Derflinger. Okay, so I'm beginning to run out of voice. William Proudfoot, what do you think the future of navies will be, taking into account developments such as railguns and CV killing missiles? Have major navies overcommitted to quality over quantity? Quality over quantity is, with the advent of drones, is a bit of a relative term. I mean, as I say, on this channel I don't tend to talk about it too much because it does involve a lot of speculation. The thing is, there are so many modern technologies and counters to that technology and counters to the counters. You can speculate in all sorts of different ways, whether it be lasers, railguns, gun-fired missiles, drones, etc., etc. If you want to hear several hours of me and others speculating on the future of navies, I do a weekly podcast called Bilge Pumps with Dr. Clark and Jamie from Armoured Carriers. And we do, in that podcast, do a fair bit of speculation about the possible futures of various navies and technologies. So I would probably recommend that, because if you go and have a look at that, or listen to that, you'll get hours upon hours of us speculating, as opposed to 5 minutes of précis speculation here. Scooter GSP, during their war planning, did the Japanese take into account that any ships present at Pearl Harbor during an attack would most likely be repaired and excuse me, now I've got hiccups, returned to service? They didn't think the war would last that long. Basically. And for Dave, I'm trying to get a good copy of The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, both volumes. Where can I get a good copy? Is Dover Publications good? Can you help, please? Amazon has a fairly decent copy. I'm just trying to see where mine is. Let me have a look. Let me just see if I can find my copy. It may be upstairs in the more general reference library, but it may be around here somewhere. Yeah, so this is my copy of the first volume, Influence of Naval Sea Power Upon History 1660 to 1783, Alfred Th. Mahan. I got this off of Amazon.co.uk, and this is Pantianos Classics, whoever they are. It's a pretty nice paperback version. good size script, fairly legible. Map, the occasional diagram could afford to be a little bit bigger, but then they are scanned in from the original book, so yeah, it's a good enough reference copy now. I must remember to put that back where I found it. So where did I find it? Oh yes, that was it. Yeah. Kaiju director Sean Connery or as Cochrane and Roger Moore as Nelson? I'm not so sure about Roger Moore as Nelson. Sean Connery as Cochrane, maybe. Maybe Colin Firth as Cochrane. That would be amusing. Cody85, the Japanese have chosen to scrap the Congos and build new ships reusing the 14-inch guns as fast carrier escorts. What do you think they'd do? Probably something along the lines of their B-64-65 style designs. I would imagine. Because that can reuse the guns, although it would take longer. Galdir Eonai, this has come up in another YouTuber's video comments. 15-inch full auto gun. What would cause it to fail first? Breach failure, loading mishap, barrel melting? Full auto 15-inch gun. Probably a breach failure caused by a loading mishap, I would imagine. The biggest problem with auto-loading Battleship caliber equipment would have been the fact that you've got the bag charges. That would have been your biggest. That would be your single biggest problem, because they're not rigid like the shell case, like the cartridge casings were for the smaller guns that were made for auto. So statistically, if you're chucking loads of them downrange at very high speeds of loading, one of those bags is probably going to fail first, and then that's going to go badly. Excuse me, I'm now beginning to properly lose my voice, just as I recorded this weekend's videos already. Right, so Captain Seafort, hypothesis. The only major difference between Nelson's command style and BT's adjusted for technology is BT lacked Nelson's vital attention to detail. Agree or disagree? Broadly agree. If that attention to detail includes the fact that Nelson kept his captains very well informed up to the battle, then yes, I would agree completely. The difference is BT left very vague instructions where he left instructions at all and expected people to just kind of vaguely get the idea of what he was doing and use their initiative to follow him. Nelson did give his captains an awful lot of latitude for initiative, but he made sure they knew in extensive detail exactly what his plan was beforehand, so that they could then inform their initiative based on that. Ralph's Place has also noticed the Star Fury, yes. I also have a rather oversized Firestorm class frigate from Battle Fleet Gothic, which I've been painting off and on in the various parts of lockdown. It's an oversized model made in resin, because the actual Battle Fleet Gothic miniature is about this big. It's very, very nice and offers great opportunity for painting. This one's done up as Admech ship. I've got a bunch of those upstairs. Cobra class, Falchion class, Sword class, Firestorm class. There's a guy on Facebook who casts them up. They're really good. I've also got a Dauntless class and a Space Marine Strike Cruiser that can probably top out at 3 or 4 feet, which I'm in the middle of painting. That's going to be hilarious. I actually also do have a really nice plastic kit for Babylon 5 itself, but I just haven't brought myself to paint it because it's going to be about this big, and I really want to make sure my painting skills have recovered up to full spec before I give it a go. Yeah. 99 Duke. Don't forget the question from HMS Bristol. Good point. It is a real pity that HMS Bristol looks like it's going to be decommissioned and scrapped, but unfortunately, if this had been 10 years ago, actually no, 10 years ago was the beginning of the last recession. If this had been 15 years ago, 2005, 2008, something like that, there's probably a fairly decent chance she would have been preserved as a museum ship. Unfortunately, she's fallen into the same hole as an awful lot of British capital ships and ships that should have been preserved as museum ships, of coming to the end of their useful service life in a period where there's just not the money. The money could be made available, but the government doesn't want to make the money available and can excuse that behind various economic reasons. Somebody asked for the link to bilge pumps, so I will... Where have I gone? There, I have typed the link in the chat. That's the link to Bilge Pumps episode 1. Don't hold that against us, but there's quite a few episodes of that. And actually, to be honest, I would genuinely recommend you listen to Bilge Pumps. Not just because it's got me, Dr. Clark, and Jamie in it, but we've had some absolutely fantastic guests on. We've had Andrew Lambert, Lawton Professor of Naval History at King's College London. We've had Michael Clapp, who was the Amphibious Task Force Commander for the Royal Navy in the Falklands. We've had Steve George, who was one of the aircraft engineers aboard HMS Invincible during the Falklands. I won't spoil our upcoming guest, but we've had an upcoming guest. We've got an upcoming guest, one we were talking to earlier today. The episode is upcoming about talking about the Roman Navy. We've had both Commander Salamander and the other Sal from various other naval podcasts. We've had a lot of really good guests who have been out there, they've been there, they've done that, and they're happy to share their knowledge with us. And yeah, there's plenty more guests we could go into, and we're going to have even more I wouldn't say better ones, because some of them are very difficult to top, but we're going to have even more high quality guests going forwards. So yeah, the first few are the three of us kind of speculating and talking about various subjects. I think there was a whole run where we were talking about China, and now we've kind of managed to get away from that. But anyway. Okay, I'm going to go with two more questions, and then I'm going to call it. So, or maybe three, because that one's quite easy. Militaristics. Will there ever be a BT list Drydock? If there's ever a Drydock where I answer a bunch of questions where BT is not tangentially involved, probably. Who's that? Lost Muffin Man. If the Soviet Navy had not existed in World War II, what would this have affected World War II in any significant way? Somewhat. The Soviet Navy in the Black Sea was running supplies into the besieged Soviet cities there for a fair bit of time, so that would have made their position a lot harder. In the Baltic, there was a little bit of gunfire support, but it was more about, to be honest, I'd say it was a little bit of a deterrent effect against the Germans sending naval forces in there to act on their behalf, but to be perfectly honest, the Baltic fleet didn't really come out all that much. It had a minimal amount of deterrent effect, but not a huge amount. I'd say of the three major operational areas of the northern sort of Arctic areas, the Baltic and the Black Sea, the Soviet Navy probably had the single greatest ongoing impact in the Black Sea than anything else. Now, there was another question somewhere around that was asking about the Soviet Navy as well. So there was... Okay, apparently the silencing on my phone has worn off. There was a Russian... I presume Russian because I can't read Cyrillic, but there was a Russian person somewhere asking if they could ask questions about the Soviet Navy. Yes, you certainly can. I'm happy to give the answers that I can do. I do have a fairly decent set of reference material on Soviet warships, but outside of a few ones that I know are very good, there's a number of articles in the Warship Journal that cover specific classes, and there's a couple of books like Russian and Soviet Battleships by Stephen McLaughlin, which I've got a copy of. But I am aware that outside of stuff that's been published maybe post mid-90s, anything that comes before that is probably very heavily biased and or incomplete. So questions about Russian/Soviet naval forces are welcome, but where appropriate I will qualify it. If I can't find a tremendous amount of information, I can say 100% is likely to be reliable. And hello, my Max X. Breedley asks, I think which will be the last one. Breedley asks, should Japan have sent the surface fleet first at Midway, obviously minus the landing vessels, as bait to tank the fighters and bombers and provide some scouting and warn about inbound fighters? In retrospect, it might be easy to see it that way, and certainly if the surface fleet had been heading screaming in, guns blazing for Midway, that would have probably prompted a lot of angry American carrier aircraft to swarm them, which might have bought the Japanese carriers enough time to rearm and hit the American carriers hard. But at the same time, tactically, for what the Japanese thought was going to happen, there's no reason for them to do that. So it's one of these things of if you've in retrospect, it probably would be one of the better ideas, assuming the Americans don't know what you're doing. But at the time, it's very difficult to see a scenario where the Japanese could turn around and say, yes, this is why we're going to do this, and actually justify it, especially given the risks they'd be running of... Well, they know what they've just done to the American battleships at Pearl Harbor. They'd know the risks they're running with their surface action fleet. The only other thing I'm going to mention just before I go is a couple of things. Isolde 74 Captain Evans, he probably would reach a similar kind of rank to Arleigh Burke, I would imagine, just a bit later. So a couple of things. Trip to Sweden. I don't know if there are any people from Sweden here, but I will be making that trip. Things have changed a bit since I initially decided I was going there, so that the Vasa Museum has shut to the public, but I've spoken with the Vasa Museum. They're willing to have me and my cameraman in as pre-arranged individuals, because we are going to be interviewing people as well. So it's still worth me making the trip. Obviously, yes, we are in lockdown in the UK now, but one of the exemptions is for business travel, and I will be responsible. Obviously, I will be wearing all the proper protective equipment and so on and so forth. So that trip will still be going on. If you happen to be in Stockholm on the 16th, Monday the 16th of November, then once I'm done with filming in the museum during the day, then in the evening, late afternoon, early evening, I'm perfectly happy to meet up with people. I'm still willing to listen to anyone if anyone's got any recommendations for restaurants and such like that could provide a decent amount of food. Just be aware I don't like eating vegetation. If you can recommend a restaurant that does really good meat and carbs, great. If you take me to a vegan place, I'll just kind of glare at you angrily. yeah, so that is still happening, barring massive changes. The only other thing I thought I should mention is that my scanner, believe it or not, has arrived. It's been on a ship for 8 months, but it's arrived. My big, well, it's not actually that very big, but my scanner capable of scanning big photos has arrived. So I will at last be able to process the many photos that I've been able to acquire and start putting them up onto the website drakhinifel.co.uk to supplement the ones I've already put up, because the ones I've already put up were kind of scanned in with a manual scan, a very manual scanner. They take a very long time to do. This one does things a whole lot quicker. Also, I've discovered this one has a really good OCR software, so I have a bunch of old school stuff. Like there's a lot of this has actually been sent in very kindly by a number of you guys, subscribers. There's like a manual for the use of broadside and pivot guns from the US Navy from 1869. It's obviously going to be hilariously out of copyright, but now I can scan in really high res, format it in very quickly and easily into a PDF, and I can have that up there as well. There'll be a section, an online library of these older reference books and things like that for people to download and have a look at. So, yeah, I'll be doing that as well when I get some time. Probably the book scanning will probably be over Christmas, but I'll try and get some more pictures up over the next few weeks. So yes, if you happen to be in yeah, Coltax 100s apparently in Sweden, drop me an email. I know some of you already have, but yeah. Yeah, I just thought I'd also give you a little bit of a preview. So some of the stuff I've been able to get my hands on are things like this old photo album, and this particular one is from HMS Atheling, or Etheling, depending on how you want to pronounce it, and it has a bunch of really interesting photos in it. From the latter part of the war. This one I particularly like, this set. I mean, there's a ship's cat, which is always good, but when it comes up on screen, you can hopefully see there it loading up with some barracudas and corsairs, except it's all covered in snow, which is a fairly rare photo to see. So yeah, it's stuff like this which will also all be being scanned in and uploaded over the course of time. Celtic, and I'll just wrap up with Celtic Ogham and Garrett Shepherd asking travel-related questions, since I'm talking about that. Celtic Ogham 123, are you ever coming over to Ireland? Yes, I do want to have a look at the Titanic Museum. I do want to have a look at HMS Caroline. It's just a matter of when they're open. And I might go to a few other places. And Garrett Shepherd, are you planning to go to the US and visit the various warships? Yes, I am. It's just with the trip like that, it's going to be multiple weeks. I need to find out. I need to know well enough in advance that it's going to be safe to do so, and that the ships are going to be open. And obviously, because it requires booking lots of hotels, making travel arrangements, flights, etc., that will be a fairly long-term project. So yeah, and then I can plan. I'm actually already planning Wave 2 for America. I was planning on doing a second trip to America this coming year. It looks like Phase 1 will have to be this coming year, but Phase 2, I'm incorporating a lot more of the inland museums. Probably pop over to see Haida, and some of the stuff, more of the stuff on the West Coast, because the West Coast element was just going to be San Francisco and LA. So yeah. And hopefully Texas will have had some progress by then. But yes, as you can probably tell, I'm now right on the edge of my voice, so I will say thank you very much. I'll desperately go and find a drink and some honey, and I will see you again on another video somewhere. Bye.